Middlemarch by George Eliot. As read for LibriVox by Madame Tusk. www.rlowalrus.sitesled.com. Chapter 25. Love seeketh not itself to please, nor for itself hath any care, but for another gives its ease, and builds a heaven in hell's despair. Love seeketh only self to please, to bind another to its delight, joys in another's loss of ease, and builds a hell in heaven's despite. W. Blake, Songs of Experience. Fred Vincy wanted to arrive at Stone Court when Mary could not expect him, and when his uncle was not downstairs. In that case she might be sitting alone in the wainscoted parlour. He left his horse in the yard, to avoid making a noise on the gravel in front, and entered the parlour without other notice than the noise of the door-handle. Mary was in her usual corner, laughing over Mrs. Piozzi's recollections of Johnson, and looked up with the fun still in her face. It gradually faded as she saw Fred approach her without speaking, and stand before her with his elbow on the mantelpiece, looking ill. She, too, was silent, only raising her eyes to him inquiringly. "Mary," he began, "I'm a good-for-nothing blackguard." "I should think one of those epithets would do at a time," said Mary, trying to smile, but feeling alarmed. "I know you will never think well of me any more. You will think me a liar. You will think me dishonest. You will think I didn't care for you or your father and mother. You always do make the worst of me, I know." "I cannot deny that I shall think all that of you, Fred, if you give me good reasons. But please tell me at once what you have done. I would rather know the painful truth than imagine it." "I owed money. £160. I asked your father to put his name to a bill. I thought it would not signify to him. I made sure of paying the money myself, and I have tried as hard as I could. And now I have been so unlucky. A horse has turned out badly. I can only pay £50. And I can't ask my father for the money. He would not give me a farthing. And my uncle gave me 100 a little while ago. So what can I do? And now your father has no ready money to spare, and your mother will have to pay away her £92 that she has saved, and she says your savings must go too. You see what "Oh, poor mother! Poor father!" said Mary, her eyes filling with tears and a little sob rising, which she tried to repress. She looked straight before her and took no notice of Fred, all the consequences at home becoming present to her. He, too, remained silent for some moments, feeling more miserable than ever. "I wouldn't have hurt you for the world, Mary," he said at last. "You can never forgive me." "What does it matter whether I forgive you?" said Mary passionately. "Would that make it any better for my mother to lose money that she has been earning by lessons for 4 years, that she might send Alfred to Mr. Hamer's? Should you think all that pleasant enough if I forgave you?" "Say what you like, Mary. I deserve it all." "I don't want to say anything," said Mary more quietly, "and my anger is of no use." She dried her eyes, threw aside her book, rose and fetched her sewing. Fred followed her with his eyes, hoping that he would meet hers and in that way find access for his imploring penitence. But no. Mary could easily avoid looking upward. "I do care about your mother's money going," he said, when she was seated again and sewing quickly. "I wanted to ask you, Mary, don't you think that Mr. Featherstone, if you were to tell him, I mean about apprenticing Alfred, would advance the money? My family's not fond of begging, Fred. We'd rather work for our money. Besides, you say that Mr. Featherstone has lately given you £100. He rarely makes presents. He has never made presents to us. I'm sure my father will not ask him for anything. And if I chose to beg of him, it would be of no use." "I'm so miserable, Mary. If you knew how miserable I am, you would be sorry for me. There are other things to be more sorry for than that. But selfish people always think their own discomfort of more importance than anything else in the world. I see enough of that every day." "It is hardly fair to call me selfish. If you knew what things other young men do, you would think me a good way off the worst. I know that other people who spend a great deal of money on themselves without knowing how they shall pay must be selfish. They are always thinking of what they can get for themselves, and not of what other people may lose." "Any man may be unfortunate, Mary, and find himself unable to pay when he meant it. There's not a better man in the world than your father, and yet he got into trouble." "How dare you make any comparison between my father and you, Fred?" said Mary in a deep tone of indignation. "He never got into trouble by thinking of his own idle pleasures, but because he was always thinking of the work that he was doing for other people. And he has fared hard and worked hard to make good everybody's loss." "And you think that I shall never try to make good anything, Mary? It is not generous to believe the worst of a man. When you have got any power over him, I think you might try to use it to make him better. But that is what you never do. However, I'm going," Fred ended languidly. "I shall never speak to you about anything again. I'm very sorry for all the trouble I've caused. That's all." Mary had dropped her work out of her hand and looked up. There is often something maternal even in a girlish love, and Mary's hard experience had wrought her nature to an impressibility very different from that hard, slight thing which we call girlishness. At Fred's last words she felt an instantaneous pang, something like what a mother feels at the imagined sobs or cries of her naughty truant child, which may lose itself and get harm. And when looking up her eyes met his dull, despairing glance, her pity for him surmounted her anger and all her other anxieties. "Oh, Fred, how ill you look! Sit down a moment. Don't go yet. Let me tell uncle that you are here. He has been wondering that he has not seen you a whole week." Mary spoke hurriedly, saying the words that came first without knowing very well what they were, but saying them in a half soothing, half beseeching tone, and rising as if to go away to Mr. Featherstone. Of course, Fred felt as if the clouds had parted and a gleam had come. He moved and stood in her way. "Say one word, Mary, and I will do anything. Say you will not look the worse of me, will not give me up altogether. As if it were any pleasure to me to think ill of you," said Mary in a mournful tone. "As if it were not very painful to me to see you an idle, frivolous creature. How can you bear to be so contemptible when others are working and striving? There are so many things to be done. How can you bear to be fit for nothing in the world that is useful? And with so much good in your disposition, Fred. You might be worth a great deal." "I'll try to be anything you like, Mary, if you will only say you love me. I should be ashamed to say that I loved a man who must always be hanging on others and reckoning on what they would do for him. What will you be when you're 40? Like Mr. Boyer, I suppose. Just as idle, living in Mrs. Beck's front parlour, fat and shabby, hoping somebody will invite you to dinner, spending your morning learning a comic song. Oh, no, learning a tune on the flute." Mary's lips had begun to curl into a smile as soon as she had asked that question about Fred's future. Young souls are mobile. And before she had ended her face had its full illumination of fun. To him it was like the cessation of an ache that Mary could laugh at him, and with a passive sort of smile he tried to reach her hand, but she slipped away quickly towards the door and said, "I shall tell uncle. You must see him for a moment or two." Fred secretly felt that his future was guaranteed against the fulfilment of Mary's sarcastic prophecies. Apart from that anything which he was ready to do if she would define it, he never dared in Mary's presence to approach the subject of his expectations from Mr. Featherstone, and she always ignored them, as if everything depended on himself. But if ever he actually came into the property, she must recognize the change in his position. All this passed through his mind somewhat languidly before he went up to see his uncle. He stayed but a little while, excusing himself on the ground that he had a cold, and Mary did not reappear before he left the house. But as he rode home he began to be more conscious of being ill than of being melancholy. When Caleb Garth arrived at Stone Court soon after dusk, she was not surprised, although he seldom had leisure for paying her a visit, and was not at all fond of having to talk with Mr. Featherstone. The old man, on the other hand, felt himself ill at ease with a brother-in-law whom he could not annoy, who did not mind about being considered poor, and had nothing to ask of him, and understood all kinds of farming and mining business better than he did. But Mary had felt sure that her parents would want to see her, and if her father had not come, she would have obtained leave to go home for an hour or two the next day. After discussing prices during tea with Mr. Featherstone, Caleb rose to bid him good-bye, and said, "I want to speak to you, Mary." She took a candle into another large parlour, where there was no fire, and setting down the feeble light on the dark mahogany table, turned round to her father, and putting her arms round his neck, kissed him with childish kisses which he delighted in, the expression of his large brows softening as the expression of a great, beautiful dog softens when it is caressed. Mary was his favourite child, and whatever Susan might say, and right as she was on all other subjects, Caleb thought it natural that Fred or anyone else should think Mary more lovable than other girls. "I've got something to tell you, my dear," said Caleb in his hesitating way. "No very good news, but then it might be worse." "About money, father? I think I know what it is." "Aye? How can that be?" "You see, I've been a bit of a fool again, and put my name to a bill, and now it comes to paying, and your mother has got part of her savings. That's the worst of it. And even they don't quite make things even. We wanted £110. Your mother has 92, and I have none to spare in the bank, and she thinks that you might have some savings." "Oh, yes, I have more than £24. I thought you would come, father, so I put it in my bag. See? Beautiful white notes in gold." Mary took out the fondled money from her reticule and put it into her father's hand. "Well, but how... We only want 18. There, put the rest back, child." "But how did you know about it?" said Caleb, who, in his unconquerable indifference to money, was beginning to be chiefly concerned about the relation the affair might have to Mary's affections. Fred told me this morning." "Ah. Did he come on purpose?" "Yes, I think so. He was a good deal distressed." "I'm afraid Fred is not to be trusted, Mary," said the father with hesitating tenderness. "He means better than he acts, perhaps. But I should think it a pity for anybody's happiness to be wrapped up in him. So would your mother." "And so should I, father," said Mary, not looking up, but putting the back of her father's hand against her cheek. "I don't want to pry, my dear, but I was afraid there might be something between you and Fred, and I wanted to caution you. You see, Mary," here Caleb's voice became more tender. He had been pushing his hat about on the table and looking at it, but finally he turned his eyes on his daughter. "A woman, let her be as good as she may, has got to put up with the life her husband makes for her. Your mother has had to put up with a good deal because of me." Mary turned the back of her father's hands to her lips and smiled at him. "Well, well, nobody's perfect, but—" Here Mr. Garth shook his head to help out the inadequacy of words. "What I'm thinking of is what it must be for a wife when she's never sure of her husband, when he hasn't got the principle in him to make him more afraid of doing the wrong thing by others than of getting his own toes pinched. That's the long and short of it, Mary. Young folks may get fond of each other before they know what life is, and they may think it all holiday if they can only get each other. But it soon turns into working day, my dear. However, you may have more sense than most, and you haven't been kept in cotton wool. There may be no occasion for me to say this, but father trembles for his daughter, and you are all by yourself here." "Don't fear for me, father," said Mary, gravely meeting her father's eyes. "Fred has always been very good to me. He is kind-hearted and affectionate, and not false, I think, with all his self-indulgence. But I will never engage myself to one who has no manly independence, and who goes on loitering away his time on the chance that others will provide for him. You and my mother have taught me too much pride for that." "That's right, that's right." "Then I'm easy," said Mr. Garth, taking up his hat. "But it's hard to run away with your earnings, eh, child?" "Father," said Mary in her deepest tone of remonstrance, "take pocketfuls of love besides to them all at home," was her last word before he closed the outer door on himself. "Suppose your father wanted your earnings?" said old Mr. Featherstone with his usual power of unpleasant surmise, when Mary returned to him. "He makes but a tight fit, I reckon. You're of an age now to be saving for yourself." "I consider my father and mother the best part of myself, sir," said Mary coldly. Mr. Featherstone grunted. He could not deny that an ordinary sort of girl like her might be expected to be useful, so he thought of another rejoinder, disagreeable enough to be always apropos. "If Fred Vincey comes tomorrow, now, don't you keep him chattering. Let him come up to me." Chapter 25 Middlemarch by George Eliot. As read for LibriVox by Madame Tusk. www.rlowalrus.sitesled.com. Chapter 26 He beats me, and I rail at him. O worthy satisfaction, would it were otherwise, that I could beat him while he railed at me. Troilus and Cressida. But Fred did not go to Stone Court the next day, for reasons that were quite peremptory. From those visits to unsanitary Hounslow streets in search of diamond, he had brought back not only a bad bargain in horseflesh, but the further misfortune of some ailment which for a day or two had deemed mere depression and headache, but which got so much worse when he returned from his visit to Stone Court that, going into the dining-room, he threw himself on the sofa, and in answer to his mother's anxious question said, "I feel very ill. I think you must send for Wrench." Wrench came, but did not apprehend anything serious, spoke of a slight derangement, and did not speak of coming again on the morrow. He had a due value for the Vinceys' house, but the wariest men are apt to be dulled by routine, and on worried mornings will sometimes go through their business with the zest of the daily bell-ringer. Mr. Wrench was a small, neat, bilious man with a well-dressed wig. He had a laborious practice, an irascible temper, a lymphatic wife, and 7 children, and he was already rather late before setting out on a 4 miles drive to meet Dr. Minchin on the other side of Tipton, the decease of Hicks, a rural practitioner, having increased Middlemarch practice in that direction. Great statesmen err, and why not small medical men? Mr. Wrench did not neglect sending the usual white parcels, which this time had black and drastic contents. Their effect was not alleviating to poor Fred, who, however, unwilling as he said to believe that he was in for an illness, rose at his usual easy hour the next morning and went downstairs, meaning to breakfast, but succeeded in nothing but in sitting and shivering by the fire. Mr. Wrench was again sent for, but was gone on his rounds, and Mrs. Vincey, seeing her darling's changed looks and general misery, began to cry and said she would send for Dr. Sprague. "Oh, nonsense, mother, it is nothing," said Fred, putting out his hot, dry hand to her. "I shall soon be all right. I must have taken cold in that nasty damp ride." "Mamma," said Rosamond, who was seated near the window. The dining-room windows looked on that highly respectable street called Lowick Gate. "There is Mr. Lydgate stopping to speak to someone. If I were you I would call him in. He has cured Ellen Bulstrode. They say he cures everyone." Mrs. Vincey sprang to the window and opened it in an instant, thinking only of Fred and not of medical etiquette. Lydgate was only 2 yards off, on the other side of some iron palisading, and turned round at the sudden sound of the sash, before she called to him. In 2 minutes he was in the room, and Rosamond went out, after waiting just long enough to show a pretty anxiety conflicting with her sense of what was becoming. Lydgate had to hear a narrative in which Mrs. Vincey's mind insisted with remarkable instinct on every point of minor importance, especially on what Mr. Wrench had said and had not said about coming again. That there might be an awkward affair with Wrench Lydgate saw at once, but the ease was serious enough to make him dismiss that consideration. He was convinced that Fred was in the pink-skinned stage of typhoid fever, and that he had taken just the wrong medicines. He must go to bed immediately, must have a regular nurse, and various appliances and precautions must be used, about which Lydgate was particular. Poor Mrs. Vincey's terror at these indications of danger found vent in such words as came most easily. She thought it very ill usage on the part of Mr. Wrench, who had attended their house so many years in preference to Dr. Peacock, though Mr. Peacock was equally a friend. Why Mr. Wrench should neglect her children more than others she could not for the life of her understand. He had not neglected Mrs. Larcher's when they had the measles, nor indeed would Mrs. Vincey have wished that he should, and if anything should happen... Here poor Mrs. Vincey's spirit quite broke down, and her Niobe throat and good-humoured face were sadly convulsed. This was in the hall, out of Fred's hearing, but Rosamond had opened the drawing-room door and now came forward anxiously. Lydgate apologized for Mr. Wrench, said the symptoms yesterday might have been disguising, and that this form of fever was very equivocal in its beginnings. He would go immediately to the druggist's and have a prescription made up in order to lose no time, but he would write to Mr. Wrench and tell him what had been done. "But you must come again. You must go on attending Fred. I can't have my boy left to anybody, who may come or not. I bear nobody ill will, thank God, and Mr. Wrench saved me in the Pleursy. But he'd better let me die if... "I will meet Mr. Wrench there, then, shall I?" said Lydgate, really believing that Wrench was not well prepared to deal wisely with a case of this kind. "Pray make that arrangement, Mr. Lydgate," said Rosamond, coming to her mother's aid and supporting her arm to lead her away. When Mr. Vincey came home he was very angry with Wrench, and did not care if he never came into his house again. Lydgate should go on now, whether Wrench liked it or not. It was no joke to have fever in the house. Everybody must be sent to now not to come to dinner on Thursday. And Pritchard needn't get up any wine. Brandy was the best thing against infection. "I shall drink brandy," added Mr. Vincey emphatically, as much as to say that this was not an occasion for firing with blank cartridges. "He's an uncommonly unfortunate lad, is Fred. He'd need have some luck by and by to make up for all this, else I don't know who'd have an eldest son." "Don't say so, Vincey," said the mother with a quivering lip, "if you don't want him to be taken from me." "I will worrit you to death, Lucy, that I can see," said Mr. Vincey more mildly. "However, Wrench shall know what I think of the matter." What Mr. Vincey thought confusedly was that the fever might somehow have been hindered if Wrench had shown the proper solicitude about his, the mayor's, family. "I'm the last man to give in to the cry about new doctors and new parsons either, whether they're Bulstrode's men or not. But Wrench shall know what I think, take it as he will." Wrench did not take it at all well. Lydgate was as polite as he could be in his off-hand way, but politeness in a man who has placed you at a disadvantage is only an additional exasperation, especially if he happens to have been an object of dislike beforehand. Country practitioners used to be an irritable species, susceptible on the point of honour, and Mr. Wrench was one of the most irritable among them. He did not refuse to meet Lydgate in the evening, but his temper was somewhat tried on the occasion. He had to hear Mrs. Vincey say, "Oh, Mr. Wrench, what have I ever done that you should use me so? To go away and never to come again, and my boy might have been stretched a corpse." Mr. Vincey, who had been keeping up a sharp fire on the enemy infection, and was a good deal heated in consequence, started up when he heard Wrench come in, and went in the hall to let him know what he thought. "I'll tell you what, Wrench, this is beyond a joke," said the mayor, who of late had had to rebuke offenders with an official air, and who broadened himself by putting his thumbs in his armholes. "To let fever get unawares into a house like this! There are some things that ought to be actionable, and are not so. That's my opinion." But irrational reproaches were easier to bear than the sense of being instructed, or rather the sense that a younger man, like Lydgate, inwardly considered him in need of instruction. For, in point of fact, Mr. Wrench afterwards said Lydgate paraded flighty foreign notions which would not wear. He swallowed his ire for the moment, but he afterwards wrote to decline further attendance in the case. The house might be a good one, but Mr. Wrench was not going to truckle to anybody on a professional matter. He reflected, with much probability on his side, that Lydgate would by and by be caught tripping too, and that his ungentlemanly attempts to discredit the sale of drugs by his professional brethren would by and by recoil on himself. He threw out biting remarks on Lydgate's tricks, worthy only of a quack, to get himself a factitious reputation with credulous people. That cant about cures was never got up by sound practitioners. This was a point on which Lydgate smarted as much as Wrench could desire. To be puffed by ignorance was not only humiliating, but perilous, and not more enviable than the reputation of the weather prophet. He was impatient of the foolish expectations amidst which all work must be carried on, and likely enough to damage himself as much as Mr. Wrench could wish by an unprofessional openness. However, Lydgate was installed as medical attendant on the Vinceys, and the event was a subject of general conversation in Middlemarch. Some said that the Vinceys had behaved scandalously, that Mr. Vincey had threatened Wrench, and that Mrs. Vincey had accused him of poisoning her son. Others were of the opinion that Mr. Lydgate's passing by was providential, that he was powerfully clever in fevers, and that Bulstrode was in the right to bring him forward. Many people believed that Lydgate's coming to the town at all was really due to Bulstrode, and Mrs. Taft, who was always counting stitches and gathered her information in misleading fragments caught between the rows of her knitting, had got it into her head that Mr. Lydgate was a natural son of Bulstrode's, a fact which seemed to justify her suspicions of evangelical laymen. She one day communicated this piece of knowledge to Mrs. Fairbrother, who did not fail to tell her son of it, observing, "I should not be surprised at anything in Bulstrode, but I should be sorry to think it of Mr. Lydgate." "Why, mother," said Mr. Fairbrother, after an explosive laugh, "you know very well that Lydgate is of a good family in the north. He never heard of Bulstrode before he came here." "That is satisfactory so far as Mr. Lydgate is concerned, Camden," said the old lady with an air of precision. "But as to Bulstrode, the report may be true of some other son." Chapter 26 Middlemarch by George Eliot. As read for LibriVox by Madame Tusk. www.rlowalrus.sitesled.com. Chapter 27 Let the high muse chant love's Olympian. We are but mortals, and must sing of man. An eminent philosopher among my friends, who can dignify even your ugly furniture by lifting it into serene light of science, has shown me this pregnant little fact. Your pier glass, or extensive surface of polished steel made to be rubbed by a housemaid, will be minutely and multitudinously scratched in all directions, but place it now against a lighted candle as a centre of illumination, and lo! the scratches will seem to arrange themselves in a fine series of concentric circles round that little sun. It is demonstrable that the scratches are going everywhere impartially, and it is only your candle which produces the flattering illusion of a concentric arrangement, its light falling with an exclusive optical selection. These things are reparable. The scratches are events, and the candle is the egoism of any person now absent. Of Miss Vincey, for example. Rosamond had a providence of her own, who had kindly made her more charming than other girls, and who seemed to have arranged Fred's illness and Mr. Wrench's mistake in order to bring her and Lydgate within effective proximity. It would have been to contravene these arrangements if Rosamond had consented to go away to Stone Court or elsewhere, as her parents wished her to, especially since Mr. Lydgate thought the precaution needless. Therefore, while Miss Morgan and the children were sent away to a farmhouse the morning after Fred's illness had declared itself, Rosamond refused to leave papa and mamma. Poor mamma, indeed, was an object to touch any creature born of woman, and Mr. Vincey, who doted on his wife, was more alarmed on her account than on Fred's. But for his insistence that she would have taken no rest, her brightness was all bedimmed. Unconscious of her costume, which had always been so fresh and gay, she was like a sick bird with languid eye and plumage ruffled, her senses dulled to the sights and sounds that used to interest her. Fred's delirium, in which he seemed to be wandering out of her reach, tore her heart. After her first outburst against Mr. Wrench, she went about very quietly. Her one low cry was to Lydgate. She would follow him out of the room and put her hand on his arm, moaning out, "Save my boy." Once she pleaded, "He has always been good to me, Mr. Lydgate. He never had a hard word for his mother." As if poor Fred's sufferings were an accusation against him. All the deepest fibres of the mother's memory were stirred, and the young man, whose voice took a gentler tone when he spoke to her, was one with the babe whom she had loved, with a love new to her, before he was born. "I have good hope, Mrs. Vincey," Lydgate would say. "Come down with me and let us talk about the food." In that way he led her to the parlour where Rosamund was, and made a change for her, surprising her into taking some tea or broth which had been prepared for her. There was a constant understanding between him and Rosamund on these matters. He almost always saw her before going to the sick room, and she appealed to him as to what she could do for mamma. Her presence of mind and adroitness in carrying out his hints were admirable, and it is not wonderful that the idea of seeing Rosamund began to mingle itself with his interest in the case, especially when the critical stage was past and he began to feel confident of Fred's recovery. In the more doubtful time he had advised calling in Dr. Sprague, who, if he could, would rather have remained neutral on Wrench's account. But after 2 consultations the conduct of the case was left to Lydgate, and there was every reason to make him assiduous. Morning and evening he was at Mr. Vincey's, and gradually the visits became cheerful, as Fred became simply feeble, and lay not only in need of the utmost petting, but conscious of it, so that Mrs. Vincey felt as if, after all, the illness had made a festival for her tenderness. Both father and mother held it an added reason for good spirits when old Mr. Featherstone sent messages by Lydgate, saying that Fred must make haste and get well, as he, Peter Featherstone, could not do without him, and missed his visits sadly. The old man himself was getting bedridden. Mrs. Vincey told these messages to Fred when he could listen, and he turned towards her his delicate, pinched face, from which all the thick blonde hair had been cut away, and in which the eyes seemed to have got larger, yearning for some word about Mary, wondering what she felt about his illness. No words passed his lips, but to hear with the eyes belongs to love's rare wit, and the mother in the fullness of her heart not only divined Fred's longing, but felt ready for any sacrifice in order to satisfy him. "If I can only see my boy strong again," she said in her loving folly. "And who knows? Perhaps master of Stone Court, and he can marry anybody he likes then." "Not if they won't have me, mother," said Fred. The illness had made him childish, and tears came as he spoke. "Oh, take a bit of jelly, my dear," said Mrs. Vincey, secretly incredulous of any such refusal. She never left Fred's side when her husband was not in the house, and thus Rosamund was in the usual position of being much alone. Lydgate naturally never thought of staying long with her, yet it seemed that the brief impersonal conversations they had together were creating that peculiar intimacy which consists in shyness. They were obliged to look at each other in speaking, and somehow the looking could not be carried through as the matter of course which it really was. Lydgate began to feel this sort of consciousness unpleasant, and one day looked down, or anywhere, like an ill-worked puppet. But this turned out badly. The next day Rosamund looked down, and the consequence was that when their eyes met again, both were more conscious than before. There was no help for this in science, and as Lydgate did not want to flirt, there seemed to be no help for it in folly. It was therefore a relief when neighbours no longer considered the house in quarantine, and when the chances of seeing Rosamund alone were very much reduced. But that intimacy of mutual embarrassment, in which each feels that the other is feeling something, having once existed, its effect is not to be done away with. Talk about the weather and other well-bred topics is apt to seem a hollow device, and behaviour can hardly become easy unless it frankly recognizes a mutual fascination, which of course did not mean anything deep or serious. This was the way in which Rosamund and Lydgate slid gracefully into ease and made their intercourse lively again. Visitors came and went as usual. There was once more music in the drawing-room, and all the extra hospitality of Mr. Vincey's mayoralty returned. Lydgate, whenever he could, took his seat by Rosamund's side, and lingered to hear her music, calling himself her captive, meaning all the while not to be her captive. The preposterousness of the notion that he could at once set up a satisfactory establishment as a married man was a sufficient guarantee against danger. This play at being a little in love was agreeable, and did not interfere with graver pursuits. Flirtation, after all, was not necessarily a singeing process. Rosamund, on her part, had never enjoyed the days so much in her life before. She was sure of being admired by someone worth captivating, and she did not distinguish flirtation from love, either in herself or in another. She seemed to be sailing with a fair wind just whither she would go, and her thoughts were much occupied with a handsome house in Lowick Gate, which she hoped would by and by be vacant. She was quite determined, when she was married, to rid herself adroitly of all the visitors who were not agreeable to her at her father's, and she imagined the drawing-room in her favourite house with various styles of furniture. Certainly her thoughts were much occupied with Lydgate himself. He seemed to her almost perfect. If he had known his notes, so that his enchantment under her music had been less like an emotional elephant's, and if he had been able to discriminate better the refinements of her taste in dress, she could hardly have mentioned a deficiency in him. How different he was from young Plymdale or Mr. Caius Larcher! Those young men had not a notion of French, and could speak on no subject with striking knowledge, except perhaps the dyeing and carrying trades, which of course they were ashamed to mention. They were Middlemarch gentry, elated with their silver-headed whips and satin stockings, but embarrassed in their manners and timidly jocose. Even Fred was above them, having at least the accent and manner of a university man. Whereas Lydgate was always listened to, bore himself with careless politeness of conscious superiority, and seemed to have the right clothes on by a certain natural affinity, without ever having to think about them. Rosamond was proud when he entered the room, and when he approached her with a distinguishing smile, she had a delicious sense that she was the object of enviable homage. If Lydgate had been aware of all the pride he excited in that delicate bosom, he might have been just as well pleased as any other man. Even the most densely ignorant of humoral pathology or fibrous tissue, he held it one of the prettiest attitudes of the feminine mind to adore a man's pre-eminence without too precise a knowledge of what it consisted in. But Rosamond was not one of those helpless girls who betray themselves unawares, and whose behaviour is awkwardly driven by their impulses, instead of being steered by wary grace and propriety. Do you imagine that her rapid forecast and rumination concerning house furniture and society were ever discernible in her conversation even with her mamma? On the contrary, she would have expressed the prettiest surprise and disapprobation if she had heard that another young lady had been detected in that immodest prematureness. Indeed, would probably have disbelieved in its possibility. For Rosamond never showed any unbecoming knowledge, and was always that combination of correct sentiments, music, dancing, drawing, elegant note-writing, private album for extracted verse, and perfect blonde loveliness, which made the irresistible woman for the doomed man of that date. Think no unfair evil of her, pray, for she had no wicked plots, nothing sordid or mercenary. In fact, she never thought of money, except as something necessary which other people would always provide. She was not in the habit of devising falsehoods, and if her statements were no direct clue to fact, why, they were not intended in that light. They were among her elegant accomplishments, intended to please. Nature had inspired many arts in finishing Mrs. Lemon's favourite pupil, who, by general consent, Fred's excepted, was a rare compound of beauty, cleverness, and amiability. Lydgate found it more and more agreeable to be with her, and there was no constraint now. There was a delightful interchange of influence in their eyes, and what they said had that superfluity of meaning for them, which is observable with some sense of flatness by a third person. Still, they had no interviews or asides from which a third person need have been excluded. In fact, they flirted, and Lydgate was secure in the belief that they did nothing else. If a man could not love and be wise, surely he could flirt and be wise at the same time. Really, the men in Middlemarch, except Mr. Fairbrother, were great bores, and Lydgate did not care about commercial politics or cards. What was he to do for relaxation? He was often invited to the Bulstrodes, but the girls there were hardly out of the schoolroom, and Mrs. Bulstrode's naive way of conciliating piety and worldliness, the nothingness of this life and the desirability of cut glass, the consciousness at once of filthy rags and the best damask, was not a sufficient relief from the weight of her husband's invariable seriousness. The Vincey's house, with all its faults, was the pleasanter by contrast. Besides, it nourished Rosamond, sweet to look at as a half-opened blush rose, and adorned with accomplishments for the refined amusement of man. But he made some enemies, other than medical, by his success with Miss Vincey. One evening he came into the drawing-room rather late, when several other visitors were there. The card-table had drawn off the dealers, and Mr. Ned Plymdale, one of the good matches in Middlemarch, though not one of its leading minds, was in tete-a-tete with Rosamond. He had brought the last Keepsake, the gorgeous watered silk publication which marked modern progress at that time, and he considered himself very fortunate that he could be the first to look over it with her, dwelling on the ladies and gentlemen with shiny copper-plate cheeks and copper-plate smiles, and pointing to comic verses as capital and sentimental stories as interesting. Rosamond was gracious, and Mr. Ned was satisfied that he had the very best thing in art and literature as a medium for paying addresses, the very thing to please a nice girl. He had also reasons, deep rather than ostensible, for being satisfied with his own appearance. To superficial observers his chin had too vanishing an aspect, looking as if it were being gradually reabsorbed, and it did indeed cause him some difficulty about the fit of his satin stocks, for which chins were at that time useful.
I think the Honourable Mrs. S. is something like you," said Mr. Ned. He kept the book open at the bewitching portrait and looked at it rather languishingly.
"Her back is very large. She seems to have sat for that," said Rosamond, not meaning any satire, but thinking how red young Plymdale's hands were, and wondering why Lydgate did not come. She went on with her chatting all the while.
"I did not say she was as beautiful as you are," said Mr. Ned, venturing to look from the portrait to its rival.
"I suspect you of being an adroit flatterer," said Rosamond, feeling sure that she should have to reject this young man a second time. But now Lydgate came in. The book was closed before he reached Rosamond's corner, and as he took his seat with easy confidence on the other side of her, young Plymdale's jaw fell like a barometer towards the cheerless side of change. Rosamond enjoyed not only Lydgate's presence but its effect. She liked to excite jealousy. "What a late comer you are," she said as they shook hands. "Mamma had given you up a while ago. How do you find Fred?"
"As usual. Going on well. But slowly. I want him to go away. To Stone Court, for example. But your mamma seems to have some objection."
"Poor fellow," said Rosamond prettily. "You will see Fred so changed," she added, turning to the other suitor. "We have looked to Mr. Lydgate as our guardian angel during this illness."
Mr. Ned smiled nervously, while Lydgate, drawing the keepsake towards him and opening it, gave a scornful laugh and tossed up his chill, as if in wonderment at human folly.
"What are you laughing at so profanely?"
said Rosamond with bland neutrality. "I wonder which would turn out to be the silliest, the engravings or the writing here," said Lydgate in his most convinced tone, while he turned over the pages quickly, seeming to see all through the book in no time, and showing his large white hands to much advantage, as Rosamond thought. "Do look at this bridegroom coming out of a church. Did you ever see such a sugared invention, as the Elizabethans used to say? Did any haberdasher ever look so smirking? Well, I will answer for it, the story makes him one of the first gentlemen in the land."
"You are so severe, I am frightened at you," said Rosamond, keeping her amusement duly moderate. Poor young Plymdale had lingered with admiration over this very engraving, and his spirit was stirred. "There are a great many celebrated people writing in the keepsake, at all events," said he, in a tone at once piqued and timid. "This is the first time I have heard it called silly." "I think I shall turn round on you and accuse you of being a Goth," said Rosamond, looking at Lydgate with a smile. "I suspect you know nothing about Lady Blessington and L.E.L."
Rosamond herself was not without relish for these writers, but she did not readily commit herself by admiration, and was alive to the slightest hint that anything was not, according to Lydgate, in the very highest taste. "But Sir Walter Scott, I suppose Mr. Lydgate knows him?" said young Plymdale, a little cheered by this advantage. "Oh, I read no literature now," said Lydgate, shutting the book and pushing it away. "I read so much when I was a lad that I suppose it will last me all my life. I used to know Scott's poems by heart."
"I should like to know when you left off," said Rosamond, "because then I might be sure that I knew something which you did not know."
"Mr. Lydgate would say that is not worth knowing," said Mr. Ned, purposely caustic. "On the contrary," said Lydgate, showing no smart, but smiling with exasperating confidence at Rosamond, "it would be worth knowing by the fact that Miss Vincey could tell me." Young Plymdale soon went to look at the whist playing, thinking that Lydgate was one of the most conceited, unpleasant fellows it had ever been his ill fortune to meet.
"How rash you are!" said Rosamond, inwardly delighted. "Do you see that you have given offence?"
"What? Is it Mr. Plymdale's book? Oh, I'm sorry I didn't think about it."
"I shall begin to admit what you said of yourself when you first came here, that you were a bear and wanted teaching by the birds."
"Well, there is a bird who can teach me what she will. Don't I listen to her willingly?" To Rosamond it seemed as if she and Lydgate were as good as engaged. That they were some time to be engaged had long been an idea in her mind, and ideas, we know, tend to a more solid kind of existence, the necessary materials being at hand. It is true, Lydgate had the counter idea of remaining unengaged, but this was a mere negative, a shadow east by our resolves, which themselves were capable of shrinking. Circumstance was almost sure to be on the side of Rosamond's idea, which had a shaping activity and looked through watchful blue eyes, whereas Lydgate's lay blind and unconcerned as a jellyfish which gets melted without knowing it. That evening, when he went home, he looked at his files to see how a process of maceration was going on with undisturbed interest, and he wrote out his daily notes with as much precision as usual. The reveries from which it was difficult for him to detach himself were ideal constructions of something else than Rosamond's virtues, and the primitive tissue was still his fair unknown. Moreover, he was beginning to feel some zest for the growing though half suppressed feud between him and the other medical men, which was likely to become more manifest now that Bulstrode's method of managing the new hospital was about to be declared, and there were various inspiriting signs that his non-acceptance by some of Peacock's patients might be counterbalanced by the impression he had produced in other quarters. Only a few days later, when he had happened to overtake Rosamond on the Lowick road, and had got down from his horse to walk by her side until he had quite protected her from a passing drove, he had been stopped by a servant on horseback, with a message calling him to a house of some importance, where Peacock had never attended, and it was the second instance of this kind. The servant was Sir James Chetham's, and the house was Lowick Manor. End of chapter 27.
Middlemarch by George Eliot. As read for LibriVox by Madame Tusk. www.rlowalrus.sitesled.com. Chapter 28. First Gentleman. All times are good to seek your wedded home, bringing a mutual delight. Second Gentleman. Why, true, the calendar hath not an evil day for souls made one by love, and even death were sweetness, if it came like rolling waves while they two clasped each other, and foresaw no life apart. Mr. and Mrs. Casaubon, returning from their wedding journey, arrived at Lowick Manor in the middle of January. A light snow was falling as they descended at the door, and in the morning, when Dorothea passed from her dressing-room avenue, the blue-green boudoir that we know of, she saw the long avenue of limes lifting their trunks from a white earth and spreading white branches against the dun and motionless sky. The distant flat shrank in uniform whiteness and low-hanging uniformity of cloud. The very furniture in the room seemed to have shrunk since she saw it before. The stag in the tapestry looked more like a ghost in his ghostly blue-green world. The volumes of polite literature in the bookcase looked more like immovable imitations of books. The bright fire of dry oak boughs burning on the logs seemed an incongruous renewal of life and glow, like the figure of Dorothea herself as she entered, carrying the red leather cases containing the cameos for Celia. She was glowing from her morning toilet, as only healthful youth can glow. There was gem-like brightness on her coiled hair and in her hazel eyes. There was warm, red life in her lips. Her throat had a breathing whiteness above the differing white of the fur, which itself seemed to wind about her neck and cling down her blue-grey pelisse with a tenderness gathered from her own, a sentient, commingled innocence which kept its loveliness against that crystalline purity of the outdoor snow. As she laid the cameo cases on the table in the bow window, she unconsciously kept her hands on them, immediately absorbed in looking out on the still, white enclosure which made her visible world. Mr. Casaubon had risen early, complaining of palpitation, was in the library giving audience to his curate, Mr. Tucker. By and by, Celia would come in her quality of bridesmaid as well as sister, and through the next weeks there would be wedding visits received and given, all in continuance of that transitional life understood to correspond with the excitement of bridal felicity, and keeping up the sense of busy ineffectiveness, as of a dream which the dreamer begins to suspect. The duties of her married life, contemplated as so great beforehand, seemed to be shrinking with the furniture and the white, vapour-walled landscape. The clear heights where she expected to walk in full communion had become difficult to see even in her imagination. The delicious repose of the soul in a complete superior had been shaken into uneasy effort and alarmed with dim presentiment. When would the days begin of that active wifely devotion which was to strengthen her husband's life and exalt her own? Never, perhaps, as she had preconceived them, but somehow, still somehow, in the solemnly pledged union of her life, duty would present itself in some new form of inspiration and give a new meaning to wifely love. Meanwhile, there was the snow and the low arc of dun vapour. There was the stifling oppression of that gentlewoman's world, where everything was done for her and none asked for her aid, where the sense of connection with a manifold, pregnant existence had to be kept up painfully as an inward vision, instead of coming from without in claims that would have shaped her energies. "What shall I do?" "Whatever you please, my dear." That had been her brief history since she had left off learning morning lessons and practising silly rhythms on the hated piano. Marriage, which was to bring guidance into worthy and imperative occupation, had not yet freed her from the gentlewoman's oppressive liberty. It had not even filled her leisure with ruminant joy of unchecked tenderness. Her blooming, full-pulsed youth stood there in a moral imprisonment which made itself one with the chill, colourless, narrowed landscape, with the shrunken furniture, the never-read books and the ghostly stag in a pale, fantastic world that seemed to be vanishing from the daylight. In the first few minutes, when Dorothea looked out, she felt nothing but the dreary oppression. Then came a keen remembrance, and turning away from the window, she walked round the room. The ideas and hopes which were living in her mind when she first saw this room, nearly 3 months before, were present now only as memories. She judged them as we judge transient and departed things. All existence seemed to beat with a lower pulse than her own, and her religious faith was a solitary cry, the struggle out of a nightmare in which every object was withering and shrinking away from her. Each remembered thing in the room was disenchanted, was deadened as an unlit transparency, until her wandering gaze came to the group of miniatures. And there, at last, she saw something which had gathered new breath and meaning. It was the miniature of Mr. Casaubon's Aunt Julia, who had made the unfortunate marriage of Will Ladislaw's grandmother. Dorothea could fancy that it was alive now. The delicate woman's face, which yet had a headstrong look, a peculiarity difficult to interpret. Was it only her friends who thought her marriage unfortunate, or did she herself find it out to be a mistake, and taste the salt bitterness of her tears in the merciful silence of the night? What breadths of experience Dorothea seemed to have passed over since she first looked at this miniature. She felt a new companionship with it, as if it had an ear for her, and could see how she was looking at it. Here was a woman who had known some difficulty about marriage. Nay, the colours deepened. The lip and chin seemed to get larger. The hair and eyes seemed to be sending out light. The face was masculine, and beamed on her with that full gaze which tells her on whom it falls that she is too interesting for the slightest movement of her eyelid to pass unnoticed and uninterpreted. The vivid presentation came like a pleasant glow to Dorothea. She felt herself smiling, and turning from the miniature, sat down and looked up as if she were again talking to a figure in front of her. But the smile disappeared as she went on meditating, and at last she said aloud, "Oh, it was cruel to speak so! How sad! How dreadful!" She rose quickly and went out of the room, hurrying along the corridor with the irresistible pulse to go and see her husband and inquire if she could do anything for him. Perhaps Mr. Tucker was gone, and Mr. Casaubon was alone in the library. She felt as if all her morning's gloom would vanish if she could see her husband glad because of her presence. But when she reached the head of the dark oak stairs, there was Celia coming up, and below there was Mr. Brooke, changing welcomes and congratulations with Mr. Casaubon. "Dodo," said Celia in her quiet staccato, then kissed her sister, whose arms encircled her, and said no more. I think they both cried a little, in a furtive manner, while Dorothea ran downstairs to greet her uncle. "I need not ask how you are, my dear," said Mr. Brooke after kissing her forehead. "Rome has agreed with you, I see. Happiness, frescoes, the antique, that sort of thing. Well, it's very pleasant to see you back again, and you understand all about art now, eh? But Casaubon is a little pale, I tell him. A little pale, you know. Studying hard in his holidays is carrying it rather too far. I overdid it at one time." Mr. Brooke still held Dorothea's hands, but had turned his face to Mr. Casaubon. "About topography, ruins, temples. I thought I had a clue, but I saw it would carry me too far, and nothing might come of it. You may go on any length in that sort of thing, and nothing may come of it, you know." Dorothea's eyes, also, were turned up to her husband's face with some anxiety at the idea that those who saw him afresh after absence might be aware of signs which she had not noticed. "Nothing to alarm you, my dear," said Mr. Brooke, observing her expression. "A little English beef and mutton will soon make a difference. It was all very well to look pale, sitting for the portrait of Aquinas, you know. We got your letter just in time. But Aquinas, now, he was a little too subtle, wasn't he? Doesn't anybody read Aquinas?" "He is not indeed an author adapted to superficial minds," said Mr. Casaubon, meeting these timely questions with dignified patience. "You would like coffee in your room, uncle?" said Dorothea, coming to the rescue. "Yes, and you must go to Celia. She has great news to tell you, you know. I leave it all to her." The blue-green boudoir looked much more cheerful when Celia was seated there, in a pelisse exactly like her sister's, surveying the cameos with a placid satisfaction, while the conversation passed on to other topics. "Do you think it nice to go to Rome on a wedding journey?" said Celia, with her ready, delicate blush, which Dorothea was used to on the smallest occasions. "It would not suit all. Not you, dear, for example," said Dorothea quietly. No one would ever know what she thought of a wedding journey in Rome. "Mrs. Cadwallader says it is nonsense, people going on a long journey when they are married. She says they get tired to death of each other and can't quarrel comfortably as they would at home. And Lady Chatham says she went to Bath." Celia's colour changed again and again, seemed to come and go with tidings from the heart, as if a running messenger had been. It must mean more than Celia's blushing usually did. "Celia!"
Has something happened?" said Dorothea, in a tone full of sisterly feeling. "Have you really any great news to tell me?" "It was because you went away, Dodo. There was nobody but me for Sir James to talk to," said Celia, with a certain roguishness in her eyes. "I understand. It is as I used to hope and believe," said Dorothea, taking her sister's face between her hands and looking at her half anxiously. Celia's marriage seemed more serious than it used to. "It was only 3 days ago," said Celia, "and Lady Chetham is very kind." "And are you happy?" "Yes. We are not going to be married yet, because everything is to be got ready, and I don't want to be married so very soon, because I think it is nice to be engaged, and we shall be married all our lives after." "I do believe you could not marry better, Kitty. Sir James is a good, honourable man," said Dorothea warmly. "He has gone on with the cottages, Dodo. He will tell you about them when he comes. Shall you be glad to see him?" "Of course I shall. How can you ask me?" "I was only afraid you would be getting so learned," said Celia, regarding Mr. Casaubon's learning as a kind of damp which might, in due time, saturate a neighbouring body. Chapter 29. Middlemarch by George Eliot. As read for LibriVox by Madame Tusk. www.rlowalrus.siteslead.com. Chapter 29. I found that no genius in another could please me. My unfortunate paradoxes had entirely dried up that source of comfort. Goldsmith. One morning, some weeks after her arrival at Lowick, Dorothea— but why always Dorothea? Was her point of view the only possible one with regard to this marriage? I protest against all our interest, all our effort at understanding being given to the young skins that look blooming in spite of trouble. For these too will get faded, and will know the older and more eating griefs which we are helping to neglect. In spite of the blinking eyes and white moles objectionable to Celia, and the want of muscular curve which was morally painful to Sir James, Mr. Casaubon had an intense consciousness within him, and was spiritually a-hungered like the rest of us. He had done nothing exceptional in marrying, nothing but what society sanctions and considers an occasion for wreaths and bouquets. It had occurred to him that he must not any longer defer his intention of matrimony, and he had reflected that in taking a wife, a man of good position should expect and carefully choose a blooming young lady, the younger the better, because more educable and submissive, of a rank equal to his own, of religious principles, virtuous disposition, and good understanding. On such a young lady he would make handsome settlements, and he would neglect no arrangement for her happiness. In return, he should receive family pleasures, and leave behind him that copy of himself which seemed so urgently required of a man to the sonneteers of the 16th century. Times had altered since then, and no sonneteer had insisted on Mr. Casaubon's leaving a copy of himself. Moreover, he had not yet succeeded in issuing copies of his mythological key, but he had always intended to acquit himself by marriage, and the sense that he was fast leaving the years behind him, that the world was getting dimmer, and that he felt lonely, was a reason to him for losing no more time in overtaking domestic delights before they too were left behind by the years. And when he had seen Dorothea, he believed that he had found even more than he demanded. She might really be such a helpmate to him as would enable him to dispense with a hired secretary, an aid which Mr. Casaubon had never yet employed, and had a suspicious dread of. Mr. Casaubon was nervously conscious that he was expected to manifest a powerful mind. Providence, in its kindness, had supplied him with the wife he needed. A wife, a modest young lady with the purely appreciative, unambitious abilities of her sex, is sure to think her husband's mind powerful. Whether Providence had taken equal care of Miss Brooke in presenting her with Mr. Casaubon was an idea which could hardly occur to him. Society never made the preposterous demand that a man should think as much about his own qualifications for making a charming girl happy as he thinks of hers for making himself happy. As if a man could choose not only his wife but his wife's husband, or as if he were bound to provide charms for his posterity in his own person. When Dorothea accepted him with effusion, that was only natural, and Mr. Casaubon believed that his happiness was going to begin. He had not had much foretaste of happiness in his previous life. To know intense joy without a strong bodily frame, one must have an enthusiastic soul. Mr. Casaubon had never had a strong bodily frame, and his soul was sensitive without being enthusiastic. It was too languid to thrill out of self-consciousness into passionate delight. It went on fluttering in the swampy ground where it was hatched, thinking of its wings and never flying. His experience was of that pitiable kind which shrinks from pity, and fears most of all that it should be known. It was that proud, narrow sensitiveness which has not mass enough to spare for transformation into sympathy, and quivers, thread-like, in small currents of self-preoccupation, or at best of an egoistic scrupulosity. And Mr. Casaubon had many scruples. He was capable of a severe self-restraint. He was resolute in being a man of honour according to the code. He would be unimpeachable by any recognized opinion. In conduct these ends had been attained. But the difficulty of making his key to all mythologies unimpeachable weighed like lead upon his mind, and the pamphlets, or parerga, as he called them, by which he tested his public and deposited small monumental records of his march, were far from having been seen in all their significance. He suspected the Archdeacon of not having read them. He was in painful doubt as to what was really thought of them by the leading minds of Brasenose, and bitterly convinced that his old acquaintance Carp had been the writer of that depreciatory recension which was kept locked in a small drawer of Mr. Casaubon's desk, and also in a dark closet of his verbal memory. These were heavy impressions to struggle against, and brought that melancholy embitterment which is the consequence of all excessive claim. Even his religious faith wavered with his wavering trust in his own authorship, and the consolations of the Christian hope in immortality seemed to lean on the immortality of the still unwritten key to all mythologies. For my part, I am very sorry for him. It is an uneasy lot, at best, to be what we call highly taught, and yet not to enjoy; to be present at this great spectacle of life, and never to be liberated from a small, hungry, shivering self, rapturously transformed into the vividness of a thought, the ardour of a passion, the energy of an action, but always to be scholarly and unspirited, ambitious and timid, scrupulous and dim-sighted. Becoming a dean or even a bishop would make little difference, I fear, to Mr. Casaubon's uneasiness. Doubtless some ancient Greek has observed that behind the big mask and the speaking trumpet there must always be our poor little eyes, peeping as usual, and our timorous lips, more or less under anxious control. To this mental estate, mapped out a quarter of a century before, to sensibilities thus fenced in, Mr. Casaubon had thought of annexing happiness with a lovely young bride. But even before marriage, as we have seen, he found himself under a new depression in the consciousness that the new bliss was not blissful to him. Inclination yearned back to its old, easier custom, and the deeper he went into domesticity, the more did the sense of acquitting himself and acting with propriety predominate over any other satisfaction. Marriage, like religion and erudition, nay, like authorship itself, was fated to become an outward requirement, and Edward Casaubon was bent on fulfilling unimpeachably all requirements. Even drawing Dorothea into use in his study, according to his own intention before marriage, was an effort which he was always tempted to defer, and, but for her pleading insistence, it might never have begun. But she had succeeded in making it a matter of course that she should take her place at an early hour in the library, and have work either of reading aloud or copying assigned her. The work had been easier to define, because Mr. Casaubon had adopted an immediate intention. There was to be a new paragon, a small monograph on some lately traced indications concerning the Egyptian mysteries, whereby certain assertions of Warburton's could be corrected. References were extensive even here, but not altogether shoreless, and sentences were actually to be written in the shape wherein they would be scanned by Brasenose and a less formidable posterity. These minor monumental productions were always exciting to Mr. Casaubon. Digestion was made difficult by the interference of citations, or by the rivalry of dialectical phrases ringing against each other in his brain. And from the first there was to be a Latin dedication, about which everything was uncertain, except that it was not to be addressed to Carp. It was a poisonous regret to Mr. Casaubon that he had once addressed a dedication to Carp in which he had numbered that member of the animal kingdom among the viros nullo able perituros, a mistake which would infallibly lay the dedicator open to ridicule in the next age, and might even be chuckled over by Pike and Tench in the present. Thus Mr. Casaubon was in one of his busiest epochs, and, as I began to say a little while ago, Dorothea joined him early in the library, where he had breakfasted alone. Celia at this time was on a second visit to Lowick, probably the last before her marriage, and was in the drawing-room expecting Sir James. Dorothea had learned to read the signs of her husband's mood, and she saw that the morning had become more foggy there during the last hour. She was going silently to her desk when he said, in that distant tone which implied that he was discharging a disagreeable duty, "Dorothea, here's a letter for you, which was enclosed in one addressed to me." It was a letter of 2 pages, and she immediately looked at the signature. "Mr. Ladislaw! What can he have to say to me?" she exclaimed in a tone of pleased surprise. "But," she added, looking at Mr. Casaubon, "I can imagine what he has written to you about." "You can, if you please, read the letter," said Mr. Casaubon severely, pointing to it with his pen and not looking at her. "But I may well say beforehand that I must decline the proposal it contains, to pay a visit here. I trust I may be excused for desiring an interval of complete freedom from such distractions as have hitherto been inevitable, and especially from guests whose desultory vivacity makes their presence a fatigue." There had been no clashing of temper between Dorothea and her husband since that little explosion in Rome, which had left such strong traces in her mind that it had been easier ever since to quell emotion than to incur the consequence of venting it. But this ill-tempered anticipation that she could desire visits which might be disagreeable to her husband, this gratuitous defence of himself against selfish complaint on her part, was too sharp a sting to be meditated on until after it had been resented. Dorothea had thought that she could have been patient with John Milton, but she had never imagined him behaving in this way, and for a moment Mr. Casaubon seemed to be stupidly undiscerning and odiously unjust. Pity that new-born babe, which was by and by to rule many a storm within her, did not strike the blast on this occasion. With her first words, uttered in a tone that shook him, she startled Mr. Casaubon into looking at her and meeting the flash of her eyes. "Why do you attribute to me a wish for anything that would annoy you? You speak to me as if I were something you had to contend against. Wait at least until I appear to consult my own pleasure before yours." "Dorothea, you are hasty," answered Mr. Casaubon nervously. Decidedly this woman was too young to be on the formidable level of wifehood, unless she had been pale and featureless and taken everything for granted. "I think it is you who are first hasty in your false suppositions about my feeling," said Dorothea in the same tone. The fire was not dissipated yet, and she thought it was ignoble in her husband not to apologize to her. "We will, if you please, say no more on this subject, Dorothea. I have neither the leisure nor the energy for this kind of debate." Mr. Casaubon dipped his pen and made as if he would return to his writing, though his hand trembled so much that the words seemed to be written in an unknown character. There are answers which, in turning away wrath, only send it to the other side of the room, and to have a discussion coolly waived when you feel that justice is all on your own side is even more exasperating in marriage than in philosophy. Dorothea left Ladislaw's 2 letters unread on her husband's writing table and went to her own place, the scorn and indignation within her rejecting the reading of these letters, just as we hurl away any trash towards which we seem to have been suspected of mean cupidity. She did not in the least divine the subtle sources of her husband's bad temper about these letters. She only knew that they had caused him to offend her. She began to work at once, and her hand did not tremble. On the contrary, in writing out the quotations which had been given to her the day before, she felt that she was forming her letters beautifully, and it seemed to her that she saw the construction of the Latin she was copying, and which she was beginning to understand, more clearly than usual. In her indignation there was a sense of superiority, but it went out for the present in firmness of stroke, and did not compress itself into an inward articulate voice pronouncing the once affable archangel a poor creature. There had been this apparent quiet for half an hour, and Dorothea had not looked away from her own table when she heard the loud bang of a book on the floor, and turning quickly saw Mr. Casaubon on the library steps, clinging forward as if he were in some bodily distress. She started up and bounded towards him in an instant. He was evidently in great straits for breath. Jumping on a stool, she got close to his elbow and said, with her whole soul melted into tender alarm, "Can you lean on me, dear?" He was still for 2 or 3 minutes, which seemed endless to her, unable to speak or move, gasping for breath. When at last he descended the 3 steps and fell backward in the large chair which Dorothea had drawn close to the front of the ladder, he no longer gasped, but seemed helpless and about to faint. Dorothea rang the bell violently, and presently Mr. Casaubon was helped to the couch. He did not faint, and was gradually reviving, when Sir James Chetham came in, having been met in the hall with the news that Mr. Casaubon had had a fit in the library. "Good God, this is just what might have been expected," was his immediate thought. If his prophetic soul had been urged to particularize, it seemed to him that fits would have been the definitive expression alighted upon. He asked his informant, the butler, whether the doctor had been sent for. The butler never knew his master want a doctor before, but would it not be right to send for a physician? When Sir James entered the library, however, Mr. Casaubon could make some signs of his usual politeness, and Dorothea, who in the reaction from her first terror had been kneeling and sobbing by his side, now rose and herself proposed that someone should ride off for a medical man. "I can recommend you send for Lydgate," said Sir James. "My mother has called him in, and she has found him uncommonly clever. She has had a poor opinion of the physicians since my father's death."
Dorothea appealed to her husband, and he made a silent sign of approval. So Mr. Lydgate was sent for, and he came wonderfully soon, for the messenger, who was Sir James Chetham's man and knew Mr. Lydgate, met him leading his horse along the Lowick Road and giving his arm to Miss Vincey. Celia, in the drawing-room, had known nothing of the trouble till Sir James told her of it. After Dorothea's account, he no longer considered the illness a fit, but still something of that nature. "Poor dear Dodo, how dreadful!" said Celia, feeling as much grieved as her own perfect happiness would allow. Her little hands were clasped and enclosed by Sir James's, as a bud is enfolded by a liberal calyx. "It is very shocking that Mr. Casaubon should be ill, but I never did like him. And I think he is not half fond enough of Dorothea, and he ought to be, for I am sure no one else would have had him. Do you think they would?" "I always thought it a horrible sacrifice for your sister," said Sir James. "Yes, but poor Dodo never did what other people do, and I think she never will." "She is a noble creature," said the loyal-hearted Sir James. He had just had a fresh impression of this kind, as he had seen Dorothea stretching her tender arm under her husband's neck, and looking at him with unspeakable sorrow. He did not know how much penitence there was in that sorrow. "Yes," said Celia, thinking it was very well for Sir James to say so, but he would not have been comfortable with Dodo. "Shall I go to her? Could I help her, do you think?" "I think it would be well for you just to go see her before Mr. Lydgate comes," said Mr. James magnanimously. "Only don't stay long." While Celia was gone, he walked up and down, remembering what he had originally felt about Dorothea's engagement, and feeling a revival of his disgust at Mr. Brooke's indifference. If Cadwallader, if everyone else had regarded the affair as he, Sir James, had done, the marriage might have been hindered. It was wicked to let a young girl blindly decide her fate in that way, without any effort to save her. Sir James had long ceased to have any regrets on his own account. His heart was satisfied with his engagement to Celia, but he had a chivalrous nature. Was not the disinterested service of woman among the ideal glories of old chivalry? His disregarded love had not turned to bitterness. Its death had made sweet odours, floating memories that clung with a consecrating effect to Dorothea. He could remain her brotherly friend, interpreting her actions with generous trustfulness. End of chapter 29. Middlemarch by George Eliot. As read for LibriVox by Madame Tusk. www.rlowalrus.sitesled.com. Chapter 30. Qui veut de lasser hors de propos lasser. Pascal. Mr. Casaubon had no second attack of equal severity with the first, and in a few days began to recover his usual condition. But Lydgate seemed to think the case worth a great deal of attention. He not only used his stethoscope, which had not become a matter of course in practice at that time, but sat quietly by his patient and watched him. To Mr. Casaubon's questions about himself, he replied that the source of the illness was the common error of intellectual men, a too eager and monotonous application. The remedy was to be satisfied with moderate work, and to seek a variety of relaxation. Mr. Brooke, who sat by on one occasion, suggested that Mr. Casaubon should go fishing, as Cadwallader did, and have a turning-room, making toys and table-legs and that kind of thing. "In short, you recommend me to anticipate the arrival of my second childhood," said poor Mr. Casaubon with some bitterness. "These things," he added, looking at Lydgate, "would be to me such relaxation as towel-ticking is to prisoners in a house of correction." "I confess," said Lydgate, smiling, "amusement is rather an unsatisfactory prescription. It is something like telling people to keep up their spirits. Perhaps I had better say that you must submit to be mildly bored rather than to go on working." "Yes, yes," said Mr. Brooke. "Get Dorothea to play backgammon with you in the evenings. And shuttlecock now. I don't know a finer game than shuttlecock for the daytime. I remember it all the fashion. To be sure, your eyes might not stand that, Casaubon, but you must unbend, you know. Why, you must take some time to study conchology now. I always think that must be a light study. Or get Dorothea to read to you. Light things. Smollett, Roderick Random, Humphrey Clinker. They're a little broad, but she may read anything now she's married, you know. I remember they made me laugh uncommonly. There's a droll bit about a postillion's breeches. We've no such humour now. I have gone through all these things, but they might be rather new to you." "As new as eating thistles," would have been an answer to represent Mr. Casaubon's feelings. But he only bowed resignedly, with due respect to his wife's uncle, and observed that doubtless the works he mentions had served as a resource to a certain order of minds. "You see," said the able magistrate to Lydgate when they were outside the door,
Casaubon has been a little narrow. It leaves him rather at a loss when you forbid him his particular work, which I believe is something very deep indeed, in the line of research, you know. I would never give way to that. I was always versatile. But a clergyman is tied a little tight. If they would make him a bishop, now! He did a very good pamphlet for Peel. He would have more movement then, more show. He might get a little flesh. But I recommend you talk to Mrs. Casaubon. She is clever enough for anything, is my niece. Tell her husband wants liveliness, diversion. Put her on amusing tactics. Without Mr. Brooke's advice, Lydgate had determined on speaking to Dorothea. She had not been present while her uncle was throwing out his pleasant suggestions as to the mode in which life at Lowick might be enlivened, but she was usually by her husband's side, and the unaffected signs of intense anxiety in her face and voice about whatever touched his mind or health made a drama which Lydgate was inclined to watch. He said to himself that he was only doing right in telling her the truth about her husband's probable future, but he certainly thought also that it would be interesting to talk confidentially with her. A medical man likes to make psychological observations, and sometimes in the pursuit of such studies is too easily tempted into momentous prophecy which life and death easily set at naught. Lydgate had often been satirical on this gratuitous prediction, and he meant now to be guarded. He asked for Mrs. Casaubon, but being told that she was out walking, was going away, when Dorothea and Celia appeared, both glowing from their struggle with the March wind. When Lydgate begged to speak with her alone, Dorothea opened the library door, which happened to be the nearest, thinking of nothing at that moment but what he might have to say about Mr. Casaubon. It was the first time she had entered this room since her husband had been taken ill, and the servant had chosen not to open the shutters, but there was light enough to read by from the narrow upper panes of the windows. "You will not mind this sombre light?" said Dorothea, standing in the middle of the room. "Since you forbade books, the library has been out of the question. But Mr. Casaubon will soon be here again, I hope. Is he not making progress?" "Yes, much more rapid progress than I first expected. Indeed, he is already nearly in his usual state of health." "You do not fear that the illness will return?" said Dorothea, whose quick ear had detected some significance in Lydgate's tone. "Such cases are peculiarly difficult to pronounce upon," said Lydgate. "The only point on which I can be confident is that it will be desirable to be very watchful on Mr. Casaubon's account, lest he should in any way strain his nervous power." "I beseech you to speak quite plainly," said Dorothea in an imploring tone. "I cannot bear to think that there might be something which I did not know, and which, if I had known it, would have made me act differently." The words came out like a cry. It was evident that they were the voice of some mental experience which lay not very far off. "Sit down," she added, placing herself on the nearest chair, and throwing off her bonnet and gloves, with an instinctive discarding of formality where a great question of destiny was concerned. "What you say now justifies my own view," said Lydgate. "I think it is one's function as a medical man to hinder regrets of that sort as far as possible. But I beg you to observe that Mr. Casaubon's case is precisely of the kind in which the issue is most difficult to pronounce upon. He may possibly live for 15 years or more, without much worse health than he has had hitherto." Dorothea had turned very pale, and when Lydgate paused, she said in a low voice, "You mean if we are very careful?" "Yes. Careful against mental agitation of all kinds, and against excessive application." "He would be miserable if he had to give up his work," said Dorothea, with a quick prevision of that wretchedness. "I am aware of that. The only course is to try by all means, direct and indirect, to moderate and vary his occupations. With a happy concurrence of circumstances, there is, as I said, no immediate danger from that affection of the heart which I believe to have been the cause of his late attack. On the other hand, it is possible that the disease may develop itself more rapidly. It is one of those cases in which death is sometimes sudden. Nothing should be neglected which might be affected by such an issue." There was silence for a few moments, while Dorothea sat as if she had been turned to marble, though the life within her was so intense that her mind had never before swept in brief time over an equal range of scenes and motives. "Help me, pray," she said at last in the same low voice as before. "Tell me what I can do." "What do you think of foreign travel? You have been lately in Rome, I think." The memories which made this resource utterly hopeless were a new current that shook Dorothea out of her pallid immobility. "Oh, that would not do. That would be worse than anything," she said with a more childlike despondency, while tears rolled down. "Nothing will be of any use that he does not enjoy." "I wish I could have spared you this pain," said Lydgate, deeply touched, yet wondering about her marriage. Women just like Dorothea had not entered into his traditions. "It was right of you to tell me."
I thank you for telling me the truth. I wish you to understand that I shall not say anything to enlighten Mr. Casaubon himself. I think it desirable for him to know nothing more than that he must not overwork himself, and must observe certain rules. Anxiety of any kind would be precisely the most unfavourable condition for him." Lydgate rose, and Dorothea mechanically rose at the same time, unclasping her cloak and throwing it off as if it stifled her. He was bowing and quitting her, when an impulse, which if she had been alone would have turned into a prayer, made her say with a sob in her voice, "Oh, you are a wise man, are you not? You know all about life and death. Advise me. Think what I can do. He has been labouring all his life and looking forward. He minds about nothing else. And I mind about nothing else." For years after, Lydgate remembered the impression produced in him by this involuntary appeal, this cry from soul to soul, without other consciousness than their moving with kindred natures in the same embroiled medium, the same troublous, fitfully illuminated life. But what could he say now, except that he should see Mr. Casaubon again tomorrow? When he was gone, Dorothea's tears gushed forth and relieved her stifling oppression. Then she dried her eyes, reminded that her distress must not be betrayed to her husband, and looked round the room, thinking that she must order the servant to attend to it as usual, since Mr. Casaubon might now at any moment wish to enter. On his writing table there were letters which had lain untouched since the morning when he was taken ill, and among them, as Dorothea well remembered, there were young Ladislaw's letters, the one addressed to her still unopened. The associations of these letters had been made the more painful by that sudden attack of illness which she felt that the agitation caused by her anger might have helped to bring on. It would be time enough to read them when they were again thrust upon her, and she had had no inclination to fetch them from the library. But now it occurred to her that they should be put out of her husband's sight. Whatever might have been the sources of his annoyance about them, he must, if possible, not be annoyed again, and she ran her eyes first over the letter addressed to him, to assure herself whether or not it would be necessary to write in order to hinder the offensive visit. Will wrote from Rome, and began by saying that his obligations to Mr. Casaubon were too deep for all thanks not to seem impertinent. It was plain that if he were not grateful, he must be the poorest spirited rascal who had ever found a generous friend. To expand in any worthy thanks would be like saying, "I am honest." But Will had come to perceive that his defects which Mr. Casaubon had himself often pointed to, needed for their correction that more strenuous position which his relative's generosity had hitherto prevented from being inevitable. He trusted that he should make the best return, if return were possible, by showing the effectiveness of the education for which he was indebted, and by ceasing in future to need any diversion towards himself of funds on which others might have a better claim. He was coming to England to try his fortune, as many other young men were obliged to do whose only capital was in their brains. His friend Naumann had desired him to take charge of The Dispute, the picture painted for Mr. Casaubon, with whose permission and Mrs. Casaubon's Will would convey it to Lowick in person. A letter addressed to the Poste Restante in Paris within the fortnight would hinder him, if necessary, from arriving at an inconvenient moment. He enclosed a letter to Mrs. Casaubon, in which he continued a discussion about art, begun with her in Rome. Opening her own letter, Dorothea saw that it was a lively continuation of his remonstrance with her fanatical sympathy and her want of sturdy, neutral delight in things as they were, an outpouring of his young vivacity which it was impossible to read just now. She had immediately to consider what was to be done about the other letter. There was still time, perhaps, to prevent Will from coming to Lowick. Dorothea ended by giving the letter to her uncle, who was still in the house, and begging him to let Will know that Mr. Casaubon had been ill, and that his health would not allow the reception of any visitors. No one more ready than Mr. Brooke to write a letter. His only difficulty was to write a short one, and his ideas in this case expanded over the 3 large pages and the inward foldings. He had simply said to Dorothea, "To be sure I will write, my dear. He is a very clever young fellow, this Ladislaw. I dare say he will be a rising young man. It's a good letter. Marks his sense of things, you know. However, I will tell him about Casaubon." But Mr. Brooke's pen was a thinking organ, evolving sentences, especially of a benevolent kind, before the rest of his mind could well overtake them. It expressed regrets and proposed remedies which, when Mr. Brooke read them, seemed felicitously worded, surprisingly the right thing, and determined a sequel which he had never before thought of. In this case, his pen found it such a pity young Ladislaw should have not come into the neighbourhood just at that time, in order that Mr. Brooke might make his acquaintance more fully, and that they might go over the long neglected Italian drawings together. It also felt such an interest in a young man who was starting in life with a stock of ideas, that by the end of the second page it had persuaded Mr. Brooke to invite young Ladislaw, since he could not be received at Lowick, to come to Tipton Grange. Why not? They could find a great many things to do together, and this was a period of peculiar growth. The political horizon was expanding, and, in short, Mr. Brooke's pen went off into a little speech which it had lately reported for that imperfectly edited organ, the Middlemarch Pioneer. While Mr. Brooke was sealing this letter, he felt elated with an influx of dim projects. A young man capable of putting ideas into form, the Pioneer purchased to clear the pathway for a new candidate, documents utilized. Who knew what might come of it all? Since Celia was going to marry immediately, it would be very pleasant to have a young fellow at table with him, at least for a time. But he went away without telling Dorothea what he had put into the letter, for she was engaged with her husband, and, in fact, these things were of no importance to her. End of chapter 30.
Middlemarch by George Eliot. Chapter 31. How well you know the pitch of that great bell, too large for you to stir. Let but a flute play 'neath the fine mixed metal, listen close, till the right note flows forth a silvery rill, then shall the huge bell tremble, then the mass with myriad waves concurrent shall respond, in low soft unison. Lydgate that evening spoke to Miss Vincey of Mrs. Casaubon, and laid some emphasis on the strong feeling she appeared to have for that formal, studious man, 30 years older than herself. "Of course she is devoted to her husband," said Rosamond, implying a notion of necessary sequence which the scientific man regarded as the prettiest possible for a woman. But she was thinking at the same time that it was not so very melancholy to be mistress of Lowick Manor with a husband likely to die soon. "Do you think her very handsome?" "She certainly is handsome, but I have not thought about it," said Lydgate. "I suppose it would be unprofessional," said Rosamond, dimpling. "But how your practice is spreading! You were called in before to the Chethams, I think, and now the Casaubons." "Yes," said Lydgate, in a tone of compulsory admission; "but I don't really like attending such people so well as the poor. The cases are more monotonous, and one has to go through more fuss, and listen more deferentially to nonsense." "Not more than in Middlemarch," said Rosamond; "and at least you go through wide corridors, and have the scent of rose leaves everywhere." "That is true, Mademoiselle de Montmorency," said Lydgate, just bending his head to the table, and lifting with his fourth finger her delicate handkerchief, which lay at the mouth of her reticule, as if to enjoy its scent, while he looked at her with a smile. But this agreeable holiday freedom with which Lydgate hovered about the flower of Middlemarch could not continue indefinitely. It was not more possible to find social isolation in that town than elsewhere, and two people persistently flirting could by no means escape from the various entanglements, weights, blows, clashings, motions, by which things severally go on. Whatever Miss Vincey did must be remarked, and she was perhaps the more conspicuous to admirers and critics, because just now Mrs. Vincey, after some struggle, had gone with Fred to stay a little while at Stone Court, there being no other way of at once gratifying old Featherstone and keeping watch against Mary Garth, who appeared a less tolerable daughter-in-law in proportion as Fred's illness disappeared. Aunt Bulstrode, for example, came a little oftener into Lowick Gate to see Rosamond, now she was alone; for Mrs. Bulstrode had a true sisterly feeling for her brother, always thinking that he might have married better, but wishing well to the children. Now Mrs. Bulstrode had a long-standing intimacy with Mrs. Plymdale. They had nearly the same preferences in silks, patterns for underclothing, chinaware, and clergymen. They confided their little troubles of health and household management to each other, and various little points of superiority on Mrs. Bulstrode's side, namely, more decided seriousness, more admiration for mind, and a house outside the town, sometimes served to give colour to their conversation without dividing them. Well-meaning women both, knowing very little of their own motives. Mrs. Bulstrode, paying a morning visit to Mrs. Plymdale, happened to say that she could not stay longer because she was going to see poor Rosamond. "Why do you say poor Rosamond?" said Mrs. Plymdale, a round-eyed, sharp little woman, like a tamed falcon. "She is so pretty, and has been brought up in such thoughtlessness. The mother, you know, had always that levity about her which makes me anxious for the children." "Well, Harriet, if I am to speak my mind," said Mrs. Plymdale, with emphasis, "I must say anybody would suppose you and Mr. Bulstrode would be delighted with what has happened, for you have done everything to put Mr. Lydgate forward." "Selina, what do you mean?" said Mrs. Bulstrode, in genuine surprise. "Not but what I am truly thankful for Ned's sake," said Mrs. Plymdale. "He could certainly better afford to keep such a wife than some people can, but I should wish him to look elsewhere. Still, a mother has anxieties, and some young men would take to a bad life in consequence. Besides, if I was obliged to speak, I should say I was not fond of strangers coming into a town." "I don't know, Selina," said Mrs. Bulstrode, with a little emphasis in her turn. "Mr. Bulstrode was a stranger here at one time. Abraham and Moses were strangers in the land, and we are told to entertain strangers, and especially," she added, after a slight pause, "when they are unexceptionable." "I was not speaking in a religious sense, Harriet. I spoke as a mother. Selina, I am sure you have never heard me say anything against a niece of mine marrying your son." "Oh, it is pride in Miss Vincey. I am sure it is nothing else," said Mrs. Plymdale, who had never before given all her confidence to Harriet on this subject. "No young man in Middlemarch was good enough for her. I have heard her mother say as much. That is not a Christian spirit, I think. But now, from all I hear, she has found a man as proud as herself." "You don't mean that there is anything between Rosamond and Mr. Lydgate?" said Mrs. Bulstrode, rather mortified at finding out her own ignorance. "Is it possible you don't know, Harriet?" "Oh, I go about so little, and I am not fond of gossip. I really never hear any. You see so many people that I don't see. Your circle is rather different from ours." "Well, but your own niece, and Mr. Bulstrode's great favourite, and yours too, I'm sure, Harriet. I thought at one time you meant him for Kate, when she is a little older." "I don't believe there can be anything serious at present," said Mrs. Bulstrode. "My brother would certainly have told me." "Well, people have different ways, but I understand that nobody can see Miss Vincey and Mr. Lydgate together without taking them to be engaged. However, it is not my business. Shall I put up the pattern of mittens?" After this Mrs. Bulstrode drove to her niece with a mind newly weighted. She was herself handsomely dressed, but she noticed with a little more regret than usual that Rosamond, who was just come in, and met her in a walking dress, was almost as expensively equipped. Mrs. Bulstrode was a feminine, smaller edition of her brother, and had none of her husband's low-toned pallor. She had a good honest glance, and used no circumlocution. "You are alone, I see, my dear," she said, as they entered the drawing-room together, looking round gravely. Rosamond felt sure that her aunt had something particular to say, and they sat down near each other. Nevertheless, the quilling inside Rosamond's bonnet was so charming that it was impossible not to desire the same kind of thing for Kate, and Mrs. Bulstrode's eyes, which were rather fine, rolled round that ample quilled circuit while she spoke. "I have just heard something about you that has surprised me very much, Rosamond." "What is that, aunt?" Rosamond's eyes also were roaming over her aunt's large embroidered collar. "I can hardly believe it, that you should be engaged without my knowing it, without your father's telling me." Here Mrs. Bulstrode's eyes finally rested on Rosamond's, who blushed deeply, and said, "I am not engaged, aunt." "How is it that everyone says so, then? That it is the town's talk?" "The town's talk is of very little consequence, I think," said Rosamond, inwardly gratified. "Oh, my dear, be more thoughtful. Don't despise your neighbours so. Remember, you are turned 22 now, and you will have no fortune. Your father, I am sure, will not be able to spare you anything. Mr. Lydgate is very intellectual and clever. I know there is an attraction in that. I like talking to such men myself, and your uncle finds him very useful. But the profession is a poor one here. To be sure, this life is not everything, but it is seldom a medical man has true religious views. There is too much pride of intellect. And you are not fit to marry a poor man." "Mr. Lydgate is not a poor man, aunt. He has very high connections. He told me himself he was poor. That is because he is used to people who have a high style of living." "My dear Rosamond, you must not think of living in high style." Rosamond looked down and played with her reticule. She was not a fiery young lady, and had no sharp answers, but she meant to live as she pleased. "Then it is really true?" said Mrs. Bulstrode, looking very earnestly at her niece. "You are thinking of Mr. Lydgate? There is some understanding between you, though your father doesn't know? Be open, my dear Rosamond. Mr. Lydgate has really made you an offer?" Poor Rosamond's feelings were very unpleasant. She had been quite easy as to Lydgate's feeling and intention, but now, when her aunt put this question, she did not like being unable to say yes. Her pride was hurt, but her habitual control of manner helped her. "Pray excuse me, aunt. I would rather not speak on the subject." "You would not give your heart to a man without a decided prospect, I trust, my dear? And think of the two excellent offers I know of that you have refused, and one still within your reach, if you will not throw it away. I knew a very great beauty who married badly at last by doing so. Mr. Ned Plymdale is a nice young man, some might think good looking, and an only son, and a large business of that kind is better than a profession. Not that marrying is everything. I would have you seek first the kingdom of God, but a girl should keep her heart within her own power. I should never give it to Mr. Ned Plymdale if it were. I have already refused him. If I loved, I should love at once and without change," said Rosamond, with a great sense of being a romantic heroine, and playing the part prettily. "I see how it is, my dear," said Mrs. Bulstrode, in a melancholy voice, rising to go. "You have allowed your affections to be engaged without return." "No, indeed, aunt," said Rosamond, with emphasis. "Then you are quite confident that Mr. Lydgate has a serious attachment to you?" Rosamond's cheeks by this time were persistently burning, and she felt much mortification. She chose to be silent, and her aunt went away all the more convinced. Mr. Bulstrode, in things worldly and indifferent, was disposed to do what his wife bade him, and she now, without telling her reasons, desired him on the next opportunity to find out in conversation with Mr. Lydgate whether he had any intention of marrying soon. The result was a decided negative. Mr. Bulstrode, on being cross questioned, showed that Lydgate had spoken as no man would who had any attachment that could issue in matrimony. Mrs. Bulstrode now felt that she had a serious duty before her, and she soon managed to arrange a tete-a-tete with Lydgate, in which she passed from inquiries about Fred Vince's health, and expressions of her sincere anxiety for her brother's large family, to general remarks on the dangers which lay before young people with regard to their settlement in life. Young men were often wild and disappointing, making little return for the money spent on them, and a girl was exposed to many circumstances which might interfere with her prospects. "Especially when she has great attractions, and her parents see much company," said Mrs. Bulstrode. "Gentlemen pay her attention, and engross her all to themselves for the mere pleasure of the moment, and that drives off others. I think it is a heavy responsibility, Mr. Lydgate, to interfere with the prospects of any girl." Here Mrs. Bulstrode fixed her eyes on him with an unmistakable purpose of warning, if not of rebuke. "Clearly," said Lydgate, looking at her, perhaps even staring a little in return. "On the other hand, a man must be a great coxcomb to go about with a notion that he must not pay attention to a young lady, lest she should fall in love with him, or lest others should think she must. Oh, Mr. Lydgate, you know well what your advantages are. You know that our young men here cannot cope with you. Where you frequent a house, it may militate very much against a girl's making a desirable settlement in life, and prevent her from accepting offers even if they are made." Lydgate was less flattered by his advantage over the Middlemarch Orlandos than he was annoyed by the perception of Mrs. Bulstrode's meaning. She felt that she had spoken as impressively as it was necessary to do, and that in using the superior word militate she had thrown a noble drapery over a mass of particulars which were still evident enough. Lydgate was fuming a little, pushed his hair back with one hand, felt curiously in his waistcoat pocket with the other, and then stooped to beckon the tiny black spaniel, which had the insight to decline his hollow caresses. It would not have been decent to go away, because he had been dining with other guests, and had just taken tea; but Mrs. Bulstrode, having no doubt that she had been understood, turned the conversation. Solomon's Proverbs, I think, have omitted to say that as the sore palate findeth grit, so an uneasy consciousness heareth innuendos. The next day Mr. Fairbrother, parting from Lydgate in the street, supposed that they should meet at Vince's in the evening. Lydgate answered curtly, no, he had work to do; he must give up going out in the evening. "What! you are going to get lashed to the mast, eh, and are stopping your ears?" said the vicar. "Well, if you don't mean to be won by the sirens, you are right to take precautions in time." A few days before, Lydgate would have taken no notice of these words as anything more than the vicar's usual way of putting things. They seemed now to convey an innuendo which confirmed the impression that he had been making a fool of himself, and behaving so as to be misunderstood. Not, he believed, by Rosamond herself. She, he felt sure, took everything as lightly as he intended it. She had an exquisite tact and insight in relation to all points of manners, but the people she lived among were blunderers and busybodies. However, the mistake should go no farther. He resolved, and kept his resolution, that he would not go to Mr. Vince's except on business. Rosamond became very unhappy. The uneasiness first stirred by her aunt's questions grew and grew, till at the end of 10 days that she had not seen Lydgate, it grew into terror at the blank that might possibly come, into foreboding of that ready fatal sponge which so cheaply wipes out the hopes of mortals. The world would have a new dreariness for her, as a wilderness that a magician's spells had turned for a little while into a garden. She felt that she was beginning to know the pang of disappointed love, and that no other man could be the occasion of such delightful aerial building as she had been enjoying for the last 6 months. Poor Rosamond lost her appetite, and felt as forlorn as Ariadne, as a charming stage Ariadne left behind with all her boxes full of costumes, and no hope of a coach. There are many wonderful mixtures in the world which are all alike called love, and claim the privileges of a sublime rage, which is an apology for everything, in literature and the drama. Happily, Rosamond did not think of committing any desperate act. She plaited her fair hair as beautifully as usual, and kept herself proudly calm. Her most cheerful supposition was that her aunt Bulstrode had interfered in some way to hinder Lydgate's visits. Everything was better than a spontaneous indifference in him. Any one who imagines 10 days too short a time, not for falling into leanness, lightness, or other measurable effects of passion, but for the whole spiritual circuit of alarmed conjecture and disappointment, is ignorant of what can go on in the elegant leisure of a young lady's mind. On the 11th day, however, Lydgate, when leaving Stone Court, was requested by Mrs. Vincey to let her husband know that there was a marked change in Mr. Featherstone's health, and that she wished him to come to Stone Court on that day. Now, Lydgate might have called at the warehouse, or might have written a message on a leaf of his pocket book, and left it at the door. Yet these simple devices apparently did not occur to him, from which we may conclude that he had no strong objection to calling at the house at an hour when Mr. Vincey was not at home, and leaving the message with Miss Vincey. A man may, from various motives, decline to give his company, but perhaps not even a sage would be gratified that nobody missed him. It would be a graceful, easy way of piecing on the new habits to the old, to have a few playful words with Rosamond about his resistance to dissipation, and his firm resolve to take long fasts, even from sweet sounds. It must be confessed also that momentary speculation as to all the possible grounds for Mrs. Bulstrode's hints had managed to get woven like slight clinging hairs into the more substantial web of his thoughts. Miss Vincey was alone, and blushed so deeply when Lydgate came in that he felt a corresponding embarrassment, and instead of any playfulness he began at once to speak of his reason for calling, and to beg her, almost formally, to deliver the message to her father. Rosamond, who at the first moment felt as if her happiness were returning, was keenly hurt by Lydgate's manner. Her blush had departed, and she assented coldly, without adding an unnecessary word, some trivial chain work which she had in her hands, enabling her to avoid looking at Lydgate higher than his chin. In all failures the beginning is certainly the half of the whole. After sitting 2 long moments while he moved his whip and could say nothing, Lydgate rose to go, and Rosamond, made nervous by her struggle between mortification and the wish not to betray it, dropped her chain as if startled, and rose too, mechanically. Lydgate instantaneously stooped to pick up the chain. When he rose he was very near to a lovely little face set on a fair long neck, which he had been used to see turning about under the most perfect management of self-contented grace. But as he raised his eyes now, he saw a certain helpless quivering which touched him quite newly, and made him look at Rosamond with a questioning flash. At this moment she was as natural as she had ever been when she was 5 years old. She felt that her tears had risen, and it was no use to try to do anything else than let them stay like water on a blue flower, or let them fall over her cheeks, even as they would. That moment of naturalness was the crystallizing feather touch. It shook flirtation into love. Remember that the ambitious man who was looking at those forget-me-nots under the water was very warm-hearted and rash. He did not know where the chain went. An idea had thrilled through the recesses within him, which had a miraculous effect in raising the power of passionate love, lying buried there in no sealed sepulchre, but under the lightest, easily pierced mould. His words were quite abrupt and awkward, but the tone made them sound like an ardent, appealing avowal. "What is the matter? You are distressed. Tell me, pray." Rosamond had never been spoken to in such tones before. I am not sure that she knew what the words were, but she looked at Lydgate, and the tears fell over her cheeks. There could have been no more complete answer than that silence, and Lydgate, forgetting everything else, completely mastered by the outrush of tenderness at the sudden belief that this sweet young creature depended on him for her joy, actually put his arms around her, folding her gently and protectingly (he was used to being gentle with the weak and suffering), and kissed each of the 2 large tears. This was a strange way of arriving at an understanding, but it was a short way. Rosamond was not angry, but she moved backward a little in timid happiness, and Lydgate could now sit near her and speak less incompletely. Rosamond had to make her little confession, and he poured out words of gratitude and tenderness with impulsive lavishment. In half an hour he left the house an engaged man, whose soul was not his own, but the woman's to whom he had bound himself. He came again in the evening to speak with Mr. Vincey, who, just returned from Stone Court, was feeling sure that it would not be long before he heard of Mr. Featherstone's demise. The felicitous word demise, which had seasonably occurred to him, had raised his spirits even above their usual evening pitch. The right word is always a power, and communicates its definiteness to our action. Considered as a demise, old Featherstone's death assumed a merely legal aspect, so that Mr. Vincey could tap his snuff-box over it and be jovial, without even an intermittent affectation of solemnity, and Mr. Vincey hated both solemnity and affectation. Who was ever awestruck about a testator, or sang a hymn on the title to real property? Mr. Vincey was inclined to take a jovial view of all things that evening. He even observed to Lydgate that Fred had got the family constitution after all, and would soon be as fine a fellow as ever again. And when his approbation of Rosamond's engagement was asked for, he gave it with astonishing facility. passing at once to general remarks on the desirableness of matrimony for young men and maidens, and apparently deducing from the whole the appropriateness of a little more punch. Chapter 31. Middlemarch by George Eliot. Chapter 32. They'll take suggestion as a cat laps milk. Shakespeare, The Tempest. The triumphant confidence of the mayor, founded on Mr. Featherstone's insistent demand that Fred and his mother should not leave him, was a feeble emotion compared with all that was agitating the breasts of the old man's blood relations, who naturally manifested more their sense of the family tie, and were more visibly numerous now that he had become bedridden. Naturally, for when poor Peter had occupied his armchair in the wainscoted parlour, no assiduous beetles for whom the cook prepares boiling water could have been less welcome on a hearth which they had reasons for preferring, than those persons whose Featherstone blood was ill nourished, not from penuriousness on their part, but from poverty. Brother Solomon and sister Jane were rich, and the family candour and total abstinence from false politeness with which they were always received seemed to them no argument that their brother, in the solemn act of making his will, would overlook the superior claims of wealth. Themselves at least he had never been unnatural enough to banish from his house, and it seemed hardly eccentric that he should have kept away brother Jonah, sister Martha, and the rest, who had no shadow of such claims. They knew Peter's maxim that money was a good egg, and should be laid in a warm nest. But brother Jonah, sister Martha, and all the needy exiles held a different point of view. Probabilities are as various as the faces to be seen at will in fretwork or paper hangings. Every form is there, from Jupiter to Judy, if you only look with creative inclination. To the poorer and least favoured it seemed likely that since Peter had done nothing for them in his life, he would remember them at the last. Jonah argued that men liked to make a surprise of their wills, while Martha said that nobody need be surprised if he left the best part of his money to those who least expected it. Also, it was not to be thought but that an own brother, lying there with dropsy in his legs, must come to feel that blood was thicker than water, and if he didn't alter his will he might have money by him. At any rate, some blood relations should be on the premises, and on the watch against those who were hardly relations at all. Such things had been known as forged wills and disputed wills, which seemed to have the golden hazy advantage of somehow enabling non-legatees to live out of them. Again, those who were no blood relations might be caught making away with things, and poor Peter lying there helpless. Somebody should be on the watch. But in this conclusion they were at one with Solomon and Jane. Also, some nephews, nieces, and cousins, arguing with still greater subtlety as to what might be done by a man able to will away his property and give himself large treats of oddity, felt, in a handsome sort of way, that there was a family interest to be attended to, and thought of Stone Court as a place which it would be nothing but right for them to visit. Sister Martha, otherwise Mrs. Cranch, living with some wheeziness in the chalky flats, could not undertake the journey, but her son, as being poor Peter's own nephew, could represent her advantageously, and watch lest his uncle Jonah should make an unfair use of the improbable things which seemed likely to happen. In fact, there was a general sense running in the Featherstone blood that everybody must watch everybody else, and that it would be well for everybody else to reflect that the Almighty was watching him. Thus Stone Court continually saw one or other blood relation alighting or departing, and Mary Garth had the unpleasant task of carrying their messages to Mr. Featherstone, who would see none of them, and sent her down with the still more unpleasant task of telling them so. As manager of the household she felt bound to ask them, in good provincial fashion, to stay and eat, but she chose to consult Mrs. Vincey on the point of extra downstairs consumption, now that Mr. Featherstone was laid up. Oh, my dear, you must do things handsomely where there's last illness and a property. God knows, I don't grudge them every ham in the house. Only save the best for the funeral. Have some stuffed veal always, and a fine cheese in cut. You must expect to keep open house in these last illnesses, said liberal Mrs. Vincey, once more of cheerful note and bright plumage. But some of the visitors alighted and did not depart after the handsome treating to veal and ham. Brother Jonah, for example. There are such unpleasant people in most families. Perhaps even in the highest aristocracy there are Brobdingnag specimens, gigantically in debt and bloated at greater expense. Brother Jonah, I say, having come down in the world, was mainly supported by a calling which he was modest enough not to boast of, though it was much better than swindling either on exchange or turf, but which did not require his presence at Brassing so long as he had a good corner to sit in, and a supply of food. He chose the kitchen corner, partly because he liked it best, and partly because he did not want to sit with Solomon, concerning whom he had a strong brotherly opinion. Seated in a famous armchair, and in his best suit, constantly within sight of good cheer, he had a comfortable consciousness of being on the premises, mingled with fleeting suggestions of Sunday and the bar at the Green Man. And he informed Mary Garth that he should not go out of reach of his brother Peter while that poor fellow was above ground. The troublesome ones in a family are usually either the wits or the idiots. Jonah was the wit among the Featherstones, and joked with the maidservants when they came about the hearth, but seemed to consider Miss Garth a suspicious character, and followed her with cold eyes. Mary would have borne this one pair of eyes with comparative ease, but unfortunately there was young Cranch, who, having come all the way from the Chalky Flats to represent his mother and watch his uncle Jonah, also felt it his duty to stay and to sit chiefly in the kitchen to give his uncle company. Young Cranch was not exactly the balancing point between the wit and the idiot, verging slightly towards the latter type, and squinting so as to leave everything in doubt about his sentiments, except that they were not of a forcible character. When Mary Garth entered the kitchen, and Mr. Jonah Featherstone began to follow her with his cold detective eyes, young Cranch, turning his head in the same direction, seemed to insist on it that she should remark how he was squinting, as if he did it with design, like the gipsies when Borrow read the New Testament to them. This was rather too much for poor Mary. Sometimes it made her bilious, sometimes it upset her gravity. One day that she had an opportunity, she could not resist describing the kitchen scene to Fred, who would not be hindered from immediately going to see it, affecting simply to pass through. But no sooner did he face the four eyes than he had to rush through the nearest door, which happened to lead to the dairy, and there, under the high roof and among the pans, he gave way to laughter, which made a hollow resonance perfectly audible in the kitchen. He fled by another doorway, but Mr. Jonah, who had not before seen Fred's white complexion, long legs, and pinched delicacy of face, prepared many sarcasms in which these points of appearance were wittily combined with the lowest moral attributes. "Why, Tom, you don't wear such gentlemanly trousers. You haven't got half such fine long legs," said Jonah to his nephew, winking at the same time, to imply that there was something more in these statements than their undeniableness. Tom looked at his legs, but left it uncertain whether he preferred his moral advantages to a more vicious length of limb and reprehensible gentility of trouser. In the large wainscoted parlour, too, there were constantly pairs of eyes on the watch, and own relatives eager to be sitters up. Many came, lunched, and departed, but brother Solomon and the lady who had been Jane Featherstone for 25 years, before she was Mrs. Wall, found it good to be there every day for hours, without other calculable occupation than that of observing the cunning Mary Garth, who was so deep that she could be found out in nothing, and giving occasional dry, wrinkly indications of crying, as if capable of torrents in a wetter season, at the thought that they were not allowed to go into Mr. Featherstone's room. for the old man's dislike of his own family seemed to get stronger as he got less able to amuse himself by saying biting things to them. Too languid to sting, he had the more venom refluent in his blood. Not fully believing the message sent through Mary Garth, they had presented themselves together within the door of the bedroom, both in black, Mrs. Wall having a white handkerchief partially unfolded in her hand, and both with faces in a sort of half mourning purple, while Mrs. Vincey, with her pink cheeks and pink ribbons flying, was actually administering a cordial to their own brother, and the light complexioned Fred, his short hair curling, as might be expected in a gambler's, was lolling at his ease in a large chair. Old Featherstone no sooner caught sight of these funereal figures appearing in spite of his orders, than rage came to strengthen him more successfully than the cordial. He was propped up on a bed rest, and always had his gold-headed stick lying by him. He seized it now and swept it backwards and forwards in as large an area as he could, apparently to ban these ugly spectres, crying in a hoarse sort of screech, "Back, back, Mrs. Wall! Back, Solomon!" "Oh, brother Peter!" Mrs. Wall began, but Solomon put his hand before her repressingly. He was a large-cheeked man, nearly 70, with small furtive eyes, and was not only of much blander temper, but thought himself much deeper than his brother Peter. Indeed, not likely to be deceived in any of his fellow men, inasmuch as they could not well be more greedy and deceitful than he suspected them of being. Even the invisible powers, he thought, were likely to be soothed by a bland parenthesis here and there, coming from a man of property, who might have been as impious as others. "Brother Peter," he said, in a wheedling yet gravely official tone, "it's nothing but right I should speak to you about the Three Crofts and the manganese. The Almighty knows what I've got on my mind." "Then he knows more than I want to know," said Peter, laying down his stick with a show of truce, which had a threat in it too, for he reversed the stick so as to make the gold handle a club in case of closer fighting, and looked hard at Solomon's bald head. "There's things you might repent of, brother, for want of speaking to me," said Solomon, not advancing, however. "I could sit up with you to night, and Jane with me, willingly, and you might take your own time to speak, or let me speak." "Yes, I shall take my own time. You needn't offer me yours," said Peter. "But you can't take your own time to die in, brother," began Mrs. Wall, with her usual woolly tone. "And when you lie speechless you may be tired of having strangers about you, and you may think of me and my children." But here her voice broke under the touching thought which she was attributing to her speechless brother, the mention of ourselves being naturally affecting. "No, I shan't," said old Featherstone, contradictiously. "I shan't think of any of you. I've made my will, I tell you. I've made my will." Here he turned his head towards Mrs. Vincey, and swallowed some more of his cordial. "Some people would be ashamed to fill up a place belonging by rights to others," said Mrs. Wall, turning her narrow eyes in the same direction. "Oh, sister," said Solomon, with ironical softness, "you and me are not fine and handsome and clever enough. We must be humble, and let smart people push themselves before us." Fred's spirit could not bear this. Rising and looking at Mr. Featherstone, he said, "Shall my mother and I leave the room, sir, that you may be alone with your friends?" "Sit down, I tell you," said old Featherstone, snappishly. "Stop where you are. Good bye, Solomon," he added, trying to wield his stick again, but failing now that he had reversed the handle. "Good bye, Mrs. Wall. Don't you come again." "I shall be downstairs, brother, whether or no," said Solomon. "I shall do my duty, and it remains to be seen what the Almighty will allow." "Yes, in property going out of families," said Mrs. Wall in continuation, "and where there's steady young men to carry on. But I pity them who are not such, and I pity their mothers. Good bye, brother Peter." "Remember, I'm the eldest after you, brother, and prospered from the first, just as you did, and have got land already by the name of Featherstone," said Solomon. relying much on that reflection as one which might be suggested in the watches of the night. But I bid you good bye for the present. Their exit was hastened by their seeing old Mr. Featherstone pull his wig on each side and shut his eyes with his mouth widening grimace, as if he were determined to be deaf and blind. None the less they came to Stone Court daily, and sat below at the post of duty, sometimes carrying on a slow dialogue in an undertone in which the observation and response were so far apart that any one hearing them might have imagined himself listening to speaking automata, in some doubt whether the ingenious mechanism would really work, or wind itself up for a long time in order to stick and be silent. Solomon and Jane would have been sorry to be quick. What that led to might be seen on the other side of the wall, in the person of brother Jonah. But their watch in the wainscoted parlour was sometimes varied by the presence of other guests from far or near. Now that Peter Featherstone was upstairs, his property could be discussed with all that local enlightenment to be found on the spot. Some rural and Middlemarch neighbours expressed much agreement with the family and sympathy with their interest against the Vincies, and feminine visitors were even moved to tears in conversation with Mrs. Wall, when they recalled the fact that they themselves had been disappointed in times past by codicils and marriages for spite on the part of ungrateful elderly gentlemen, who, it might have supposed, had been spared for something better. Such conversation paused suddenly, like an organ when the bellows are let drop, if Mary Garth came into the room, and all eyes were turned on her as a possible legatee, or one who might get access to iron chests. But the younger men who were relatives or connections of the family were disposed to admire her in this problematic light, as a girl who showed much conduct, and who, among all the chances that were flying, might turn out to be at least a moderate prize. Hence she had her share of compliments and polite attentions, especially from Mr. Borthrop Trumbull, a distinguished bachelor and auctioneer of those parts, much concerned in the sale of land and cattle, a public character indeed, whose name was seen on widely distributed placards, and who might reasonably be sorry for those who did not know of him. He was a second cousin to Peter Featherstone, and had been treated by him with more amenity than any other relative, being useful in matters of business, and in that programme of his funeral, which the old man had himself dictated, he had been named as bearer. There was no odious cupidity in Mr. Borthrop Trumbull, nothing more than a sincere sense of his own merit, which, he was aware, in case of rivalry, might tell against competitors. So that if Peter Featherstone, who, so far as he, Trumbull, was concerned, had behaved like as good a soul as ever breathed, should have done anything handsome by him, all he could say was, that he had never fished and fawned, but had advised him to the best of his experience, which now extended over 20 years from the time of his apprenticeship at 15, and was likely to yield a knowledge of no surreptitious kind. His admiration was far from being confined to himself, but was accustomed professionally as well as privately to delight in estimating things at a high rate. He was an amateur of superior phrases, and never used poor language without immediately correcting himself, which was fortunate, as he was rather loud, and given to predominate, standing or walking about frequently, pulling down his waistcoat with the air of a man who is very much of his own opinion, trimming himself rapidly with his forefinger, and marking each new series in these movements by a busy play with his large seals. There was occasionally a little fierceness in his demeanour, but it was directed chiefly against false opinion, of which there is so much to correct in the world that a man of some reading and experience necessarily has his patience tried. He felt that the Featherstone family generally was of limited understanding, but being a man of the world and a public character, took everything as a matter of course, and even went to converse with Mr. Jonah and young Cranch in the kitchen, not doubting that he had impressed the latter greatly by his leading questions concerning the Chalky Flats. If anybody had observed that Mr. Borthrop Trumbull, being an auctioneer, was bound to know the nature of everything, he would have smiled and trimmed himself silently, with the sense that he came pretty near that. On the whole, in an auctioneering way, he was an honourable man, not ashamed of his business, and feeling that the celebrated Peel, now Sir Robert, if introduced to him, would not fail to recognise his importance. "I don't mind if I have a slice of that ham, and a glass of that ale, Miss Garth, if you will allow me," he said, coming into the parlour at 11:30, after having had the exceptional privilege of seeing old Featherstone, and standing with his back to the fire between Mrs. Wall and Solomon. "It's not necessary for you to go out. Let me ring the bell." "Thank you," said Mary, "I have an errand." "Well, Mr. Trumbull, you're highly favoured," said Mrs. Wall. "What, seeing the old man?" said the auctioneer, playing with his seals dispassionately. "Ah, you see, he has relied on me considerably." Here he pressed his lips together, and frowned meditatively. "Might anybody ask what their brother has been saying?" said Solomon, in a soft tone of humility, in which he had a sense of luxurious cunning, he being a rich man, and not in need of it. "Oh yes, anybody may ask," said Mr. Trumbull, with loud and good-humoured, though cutting sarcasm. "Anybody may interrogate. Any one may give their remarks an interrogative turn," he continued, his sonorousness rising with his style. "This is constantly done by good speakers, even when they anticipate no answer. It's what we call a figure of speech. Speech at a high figure, as one may say." The eloquent auctioneer smiled at his own ingenuity. "I shouldn't be sorry to hear he'd remembered you, Mr. Trumbull," said Solomon. "I was never against the deserving. It's the undeserving I'm against." "Ah, there it is, you see, there it is," said Mr. Trumbull, significantly. "It can't be denied that undeserving people have been legatees, and even residuary legatees. It is so with testamentary dispositions." Again he pursed up his lips and frowned a little. "Do you mean to say for certain, Mr. Trumbull, that my brother has left his land away from our family?" said Mrs. Wall, on whom, as an unhopeful woman, those long words had a depressing effect. "A man might as well turn his land into charity land at once as leave it to some people," observed Solomon, his sister's question having drawn no answer. "What, Blue Coat land?" said Mrs. Wall again. "Oh, Mr. Trumbull, you never can mean to say that. It would be flying in the face of the Almighty that's prospered him." While Mrs. Wall was speaking, Mr. Borthrop Trumbull walked away from the fireplace towards the window, patrolling with his forefinger round the inside of his stock, then along his whiskers and the curves of his hair. He now walked to Miss Garth's work table, opened a book which lay there, and read the title aloud with pompous emphasis, as if he were offering it for sale: "Anne of Geierstein, or the Maiden of the Mist, by the author of Waverley." Then, turning the page, he began sonorously: "The course of 4 centuries has well nigh elapsed since the series of events which are related in the following chapters took place on the continent." He pronounced the last truly admirable word with the accent on the last syllable, not as unaware of vulgar usage, but feeling that this novel delivery enhanced the sonorous beauty which his reading had given to the whole. And now the servant came in with the tray, so that the moments for answering Mrs. Wall's question had gone by safely, while she and Solomon, watching Mr. Trumbull's movements, were thinking that high learning interfered sadly with serious affairs. Mr. Borthrop Trumbull really knew nothing about old Featherstone's will, but he could hardly have been brought to declare any ignorance, unless he had been arrested for misprision of treason. "I should take a mere mouthful of ham and a glass of ale," he said reassuringly. "As a man with public business, I take a snack when I can. I will back this ham," he added, after swallowing some morsels with alarming haste, "against any ham in the 3 kingdoms. In my opinion it is better than the hams at Freshitt Hall, and I think I am a tolerable judge." "Some don't like so much sugar in their hams," said Mrs. Wall, "but my poor brother would always have sugar." "If any person demands better, he is at liberty to do so. But, God bless me, what an aroma! I should be glad to buy in that quality, I know." There is some gratification to a gentleman," here Mr. Trumble's voice conveyed an emotional remonstrance, "in having this kind of ham set on his table." He pushed aside his plate, poured out his glass of ale, and drew his chair a little forward, profiting by the occasion to look at the inner side of his legs, which he stroked approvingly. Mr. Trumbull having all those less frivolous airs and gestures which distinguish the predominant races of the North. "You have an interesting work there, I see, Miss Garth," he observed, when Mary re-entered. "It is by the author of Waverley, that is, Sir Walter Scott. I have bought one of his works myself, a very nice thing, a very superior publication, entitled Ivanhoe. You will not get any writer to beat him in a hurry, I think. He will not, in my opinion, be speedily surpassed. I have just been reading a portion at the commencement of Anne of Geierstein. It commences well. Things never began with Mr. Borthrop Trumbull; they always commenced, both in private life and on his handbills. You are a reader, I see. Do you subscribe to our Middlemarch library?" "No," said Mary. "Mr. Fred Vincey brought this book." "I am a great bookman myself," returned Mr. Trumbull. "I have no less than 200 volumes in calf, and I flatter myself they are very well selected. Also pictures by Murillo, Rubens, Teniers, Titian, Van Dyck, and others. I shall be happy to lend you any work you like to mention, Miss Garth." "I am much obliged," said Mary, hastening away again, "but I have little time for reading." "I should say my brother has done something for her in his will," said Solomon, in a very low undertone, when she had shut the door behind her, pointing with his head towards the absent Mary. "His first wife was a poor match for him, though," said Mrs. Wall. "She brought him nothing, and this young woman is only her niece, and very proud, and my brother has always paid her wage." "A sensible girl, though, in my opinion," said Mr. Trumbull, finishing his ale, and starting up with an emphatic adjustment of his waistcoat. "I have observed her when she has been mixing medicine in drops. She minds what she is doing, sir. That is a great point in a woman, and a great point for our friend upstairs, poor dear old soul. A man whose life is of any value should think of his wife as a nurse. That is what I should do if I married, and I believe I have lived single long enough not to make a mistake in that line. Some men must marry to elevate themselves a little, but when I am in need of that, I hope some one will tell me so. I hope some individual will apprise me of the fact. I wish you good morning, Mrs. Wall. Good morning, Mr. Solomon. I trust we shall meet under less melancholy auspices." When Mr. Trumbull had departed with a fine bow, Solomon, leaning forward, observed to his sister, "You may depend, Jane, my brother has left that girl a lumping sum." "Anybody would think so from the way Mr. Trumbull talks," said Jane. Then, after a pause, "He talks as if my daughters wasn't to be trusted to give drops." "Auctioneers talk wild," said Solomon. "Not but what Trumbull has made money." Chapter 32. Middlemarch, by George Eliot. Chapter 33. Close up his eyes and draw the curtain close, and let us all to meditation. Henry VI, Part 2. That night after 12 o'clock, Mary Garth relieved the watch in Mr. Featherstone's room, and sat there alone through the small hours. She often chose this task, in which she found some pleasure, notwithstanding the old man's testiness whenever he demanded her attentions. There were intervals in which she could sit perfectly still, enjoying the outer stillness and the subdued light. The red fire, with its gently audible movement, seemed like a solemn existence, calmly independent of the petty passions, the imbecile desires, the straining after worthless uncertainties, which were daily moving her contempt. Mary was fond of her own thoughts, and could amuse herself well, sitting in twilight with her hands in her lap, for, having early had strong reason to believe that things were not likely to be arranged for her peculiar satisfaction, she wasted no time in astonishment and annoyance at that fact. and she had already come to take life very much as a comedy in which she had a proud, nay, a generous resolution not to act the mean or treacherous part. Mary might have become cynical if she had not had parents whom she honoured, and a well of affectionate gratitude within her, which was all the fuller because she had learnt to make no unreasonable claims. She sat to-night revolving, as she was wont, the scenes of the day, her lips often curling with amusement at the oddities to which her fancy added fresh drollery. People were so ridiculous with their illusions, carrying their fools' caps unawares, thinking their own lies opaque while everybody else's were transparent, making themselves exceptions to everything, as if when all the world looked yellow under a lamp, they alone were rosy. Yet there were some illusions under Mary's eyes which were not quite comic to her. She was secretly convinced, though she had no other grounds than her close observation of old Featherstone's nature, that in spite of his fondness for having the Vinces about him, they were as likely to be disappointed as any of the relations whom he kept at a distance. She had a good deal of disdain for Mrs. Vince's evident alarm lest she and Fred should be alone together, but it did not hinder her from thinking anxiously of the way in which Fred would be affected if it should turn out that his uncle had left him as poor as ever. She could make a butt of Fred when he was present, but she did not enjoy his follies when he was absent. Yet she liked her thoughts. A vigorous young mind, not overbalanced by passion, finds a good in making acquaintance with life, and watches its own powers with interest. Mary had plenty of merriment within. Her thought was not veined by any solemnity or pathos about the old man on the bed. Such sentiments are easier to affect than to feel about an aged creature whose life is not visibly anything but a remnant of vices. She had always seen the most disagreeable side of Mr. Featherstone. He was not proud of her, and she was only useful to him. To be anxious about a soul that is always snapping at you must be left to the saints of the earth, and Mary was not one of them. She had never returned him a harsh word, and had waited on him faithfully. That was her utmost. Old Featherstone himself was not in the least anxious about his soul, and had declined to see Mr. Tucker on the subject. To-night he had not once snapped, and for the first hour or two he lay remarkably still, until at last Mary heard him rattling his bunch of keys against the tin box which he always kept in the bed beside him. About 3 o'clock he said, with remarkable distinctness, "Missy, come here." Mary obeyed, and found that he had already drawn the tin box from under the clothes, though he usually asked to have this done for him, and he had selected the key. He now unlocked the box, and drawing from it another key, looked straight at her with eyes that seemed to have recovered all their sharpness, and said, "How many of 'em are in the house?" "You mean of your own relations, sir," said Mary, well used to the old man's way of speech. He nodded slightly, and she went on, "Mr. Jonah Featherstone and young Cranch are sleeping here." "Oh, ay, they stick, do they? And the rest, they come every day, I'll warrant. Solomon and Jane and all the young uns, they come peeping and counting and casting up." "Not all of them every day. Mr. Solomon and Mrs. Wall are here every day, and the others come often." The old man listened with a grimace while she spoke, and then said, relaxing his face, "The more fools they. You hearken, missy. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I've got all my faculties as well as ever I had in my life. I know all my property, and where the money's put out, and everything. And I've made everything ready to change my mind and do as I like at the last. Do you hear, missy? I've got my faculties." "Well, sir?" said Mary quietly. He now lowered his tone with an air of deeper cunning. "I've made 2 wills, and I'm going to burn one. Now you do as I tell you. This is the key of my iron chest in the closet there. You push well at the side of the brass plate at the top till it goes like a bolt. Then you can put the key in the front lock and turn it. See and do that, and take out the topmost paper. Last will and testament, big printed." "No, sir," said Mary in a firm voice, "I cannot do that." Not do it! I tell you you must, said the old man, his voice beginning to shake under the shock of this resistance. I cannot touch your iron chest or your will. I must refuse to do anything that might lay me open to suspicion. I tell you I'm in my right mind. Shan't I do as I like at the last? I made two wills on purpose. Take the key, I say. No, sir, I will not, said Mary, more resolutely still. Her repulsion was getting stronger. I tell you there's no time to lose. I cannot help that, sir. I will not let the close of your life soil the beginning of mine. I will not touch your iron chest or your will. She moved to a little distance from the bedside. The old man paused with a blank stare for a little while, holding the one key erect on the ring. Then, with an agitated jerk, he began to work with his bony left hand at emptying the tin box before him. Missy, he began to say hurriedly, look here. Take the money, the notes and the gold. Look here, take it. You shall have it all. Do as I tell you. He made an effort to stretch out the key towards her as far as possible, and Mary again retreated. I will not touch your key or your money, sir. Pray don't ask me to do it again. If you do, I must go and call your brother. He let his hand fall, and for the first time in her life Mary saw old Peter Featherstone begin to cry childishly. She said, in as gentle a tone as she could command, Pray put up your money, sir, and then went away to her seat by the fire, hoping this would help to convince him that it was useless to say more. Presently he rallied and said eagerly, Look here, then. Call the young chap. Call Fred Vincey. Mary's heart began to beat more quickly. Various ideas rushed through her mind as to what the burning of a second will might imply. She had to make a difficult decision in a hurry. I will call him if you will let me call Mr. Jonah and the others with him. Nobody else, I say. The young chap. I shall do as I like. Wait till broad daylight, sir, when every one is stirring. Or let me call Simmons now, to go and fetch the lawyer. He can be here in less than 2 hours. Lawyer? What do I want with the lawyer? Nobody shall know. I say nobody shall know. I shall do as I like. Let me call someone else, sir, said Mary persuasively. She did not like her position, alone with the old man, who seemed to show a strange flaring of nervous energy which enabled him to speak again and again without falling into his usual cough. Yet she desired not to push unnecessarily the contradiction which agitated him. Let me, pray, call someone else. You let me alone, I say. Look here, missy, take the money. You'll never have the chance again. It's pretty nigh 200. There's more in the box, and nobody knows how much there was. Take it, and do as I tell you. Mary, standing by the fire, saw its red light falling on the old man, propped up on his pillows and bed rest, with his bony hand holding out the key, and the money lying on the quilt before him. She never forgot that vision of a man wanting to do as he liked at the last. But the way in which he had put the offer of the money urged her to speak with harder resolution than ever. It is of no use, sir. I will not do it. Put up your money. I will not touch your money. I will do anything else I can to comfort you, but I will not touch your keys or your money. Anything else? Anything else? Said old Featherstone, with hoarse rage, which, as if in a nightmare, tried to be loud, and yet was only just audible. I want nothing else. You come here. You come here. Mary approached him cautiously, knowing him too well. She saw him dropping his keys and trying to grasp his stick, while he looked at her like an aged hyena, the muscles of his face getting distorted with the effort of his hand. She paused at a safe distance. Let me give you some cordial, she said quietly, and try to compose yourself. You will perhaps go to sleep, and tomorrow by daylight you can do as you like. He lifted the stick, in spite of her being beyond his reach, and threw it with a hard effort which was but impotence. It fell, slipping over the foot of the bed. Mary let it lie, and retreated to her chair by the fire. By and by she would go to him with the cordial. Fatigue would make him passive. It was getting towards the chillest moment of the morning, the fire had got low, and she could see through the chink between the moreen window curtains the light whitened by the blind. Having put some wood on the fire and thrown a shawl over her, she sat down, hoping that Mr. Featherstone might now fall asleep. If she went near him, the irritation might be kept up. He had said nothing after throwing the stick, but she had seen him taking his keys again and laying his right hand on the money. He did not put it up, however, and she thought that he was dropping off to sleep. But Mary herself began to be more agitated by the remembrance of what she had gone through than she had been by the reality, questioning those acts of hers which had come imperatively and excluded all question in the critical moment. Presently the dry wood sent out a flame which illuminated every crevice, and Mary saw that the old man was lying quietly, with his head turned a little on one side. She went towards him with inaudible steps, and thought that his face looked strangely motionless. But the next moment the movement of the flame communicating itself to all objects made her uncertain. The violent beating of her heart rendered her perceptions so doubtful that even when she touched him and listened for his breathing, she could not trust her conclusions. She went to the window and gently propped aside the curtain and blind, so that the still light of the sky fell on the bed. The next moment she ran to the bell and rang it energetically. In a very little while there was no longer any doubt that Peter Featherstone was dead, with his right hand clasping the keys and his left hand lying on the heap of notes and gold. End of chapter 33. Middlemarch by George Eliot. Chapter 34. First Gentleman. Such men as this are feathers, chips, and straws, carry no weight, no force. Second Gentleman. But levity is casual too, and makes the sum of weight. For power finds its place in lack of power. Advance is cession, and the driven ship may run aground because the helmsman's thought lacked force to balance opposites. It was on a morning of May that Peter Featherstone was buried. In the prosaic neighbourhood of Middlemarch, May was not always warm and sunny, and on this particular morning a chill wind was blowing the blossoms from the surrounding gardens on to the green mounds of Lowick churchyard. Swiftly moving clouds only now and then allowed a gleam to light up any object, whether ugly or beautiful, that happened to stand within its golden shower. In the churchyard the objects were remarkably various, for there was a little country crowd waiting to see the funeral. The news had spread that it was to be a big burying. The old gentleman had left written directions about everything, and meant to have a funeral beyond his betters. This was true, for old Featherstone had not been a Harpagon, whose passions had all been devoured by the ever lean and ever hungry passion of saving, and who would drive a bargain with his undertaker beforehand. He loved money, but he also loved to spend it in gratifying his peculiar tastes, and perhaps he loved it best of all as a means of making others feel his power more or less uncomfortably. If any one will here contend that there must have been traits of goodness in old Featherstone, I will not presume to deny this, but I must observe that goodness is of a modest nature, easily discouraged, and when much elbowed in early life by unabashed vices, is apt to retire into extreme privacy, so that it is more easily believed in by those who construct a selfish old gentleman theoretically, than by those who form the narrower judgments based on his personal acquaintance. In any case, he had been bent on having a handsome funeral, and on having persons bid to it who would rather have stayed at home. He had even desired that female relatives should follow him to the grave, and poor sister Martha had taken a difficult journey for this purpose from the Chalky Flats. She and Jane would have been altogether cheered, in a tearful manner, by this sign that a brother who disliked seeing them while he was living had been prospectively fond of their presence when he should have become a testator, if the sign had not been made equivocal by being extended to Mrs. Vincey, whose expense in handsome crape seemed to imply the most presumptuous hopes, aggravated by a bloom of complexion which told pretty plainly that she was not a blood relation, but of that generally objectionable class called wife's kin. We are all of us imaginative in some form or other, for images are the brood of desire, and poor old Featherstone, who laughed much at the way in which others cajoled themselves, did not escape the fellowship of illusion. In writing the programme for his burial, he certainly did not make clear to himself that his pleasure in the little drama of which it formed a part was confined to anticipation. In chuckling over the vexations he could inflict by the rigid clutch of his dead hand, he inevitably mingled his consciousness with that livid stagnant presence, and so far as he was preoccupied with a future life, it was with one of gratification inside his coffin. Thus old Featherstone was imaginative after his fashion. However, the 3 mourning coaches were filled according to the written orders of the deceased. There were pall-bearers on horseback, with the richest scarves and hatbands, and even the under-bearers had trappings of woe which were of a good, well-priced quality. The black procession, when dismounted, looked the larger for the smallness of the churchyard. The heavy human faces and the black draperies shivering in the wind seemed to tell of a world strangely incongruous with the lightly dropping blossoms and the gleams of sunshine on the daisies. The clergyman who met the procession was Mr. Cadwallader, also according to the request of Peter Featherstone, prompted as usual by peculiar reasons. Having a contempt for curates, whom he always called understrappers, he was resolved to be buried by a beneficed clergyman. Mr. Casaubon was out of the question, not merely because he declined duty of this sort, but because Featherstone had an especial dislike to him as the rector of his own parish, who had a lien on the land in the shape of tithe; also as the deliverer of morning sermons, which the old man, being in his pew and not at all sleepy, had been obliged to sit through with an inward snarl. He had an objection to a parson stuck up above his head preaching to him, but his relations with Mr. Cadwallader had been of a different kind. The trout stream which ran through Mr. Casaubon's land took its course through Featherstone's also, so that Mr. Cadwallader was a parson who had had to ask a favour instead of preaching. Moreover, he was one of the high gentry living 4 miles away from Lowick, and was thus exalted to an equal sky with the sheriff of the county, and other dignities vaguely regarded as necessary to the system of things. There would be a satisfaction in being buried by Mr. Cadwallader, whose very name offered a fine opportunity for pronouncing wrongly, if you liked. This distinction conferred on the rector of Tipton and Freshett was the reason why Mrs. Cadwallader made one of the group that watched old Featherstone's funeral from an upper window of the manor. She was not fond of visiting that house, but she liked, as she said, to see collections of strange animals, such as there would be at this funeral; and she had persuaded Sir James and the young Lady Chetham to drive the rector and herself to Lowick, in order that the visit might be altogether pleasant. "I will go anywhere with you, Mrs. Cadwallader," Celia had said, "but I don't like funerals." "Oh, my dear, when you have a clergyman in your family, you must accommodate your tastes. I did that very early. When I married Humphrey, I made up my mind to like sermons, and I set out by liking the end very much. That soon spread to the middle and the beginning, because I couldn't have the end without them." "No, to be sure not," said the Dowager Lady Chetham, with stately emphasis. The upper window, from which the funeral could be well seen, was in the room occupied by Mr. Casaubon when he had been forbidden to work. But he had resumed nearly his habitual style of life now, in spite of warnings and prescriptions, and, after politely welcoming Mrs. Cadwallader, had slipped again into the library to chew a cud of erudite mistake about Cush and Mizraim. But for her visitors, Dorothea too might have been shut up in the library, and would not have witnessed this scene of old Featherstone's funeral, which, aloof as it seemed to be from the tenor of her life, always afterwards came back to her at the touch of certain sensitive points in memory, just as the vision of St. Peter's at Rome was inwoven with moods of despondency. Scenes which make vital changes in our neighbour's lot are but the background of our own, yet, like a particular aspect of the fields and trees, they become associated for us with the epochs of our own history, and make a part of that unity which lies in the selection of our keenest consciousness. The dreamlike association of something alien and ill understood with the deepest secrets of her experience seemed to mirror that sense of loneliness which was due to the very ardour of Dorothea's nature. The country gentry of old time lived in a rarefied social air; dotted apart on their stations up the mountain, they looked down with imperfect discrimination on the belts of thicker life below, and Dorothea was not at ease in the perspective and chilliness of that height. "I shall not look any more," said Celia, after the train had entered the church, placing herself behind her husband's elbow so that she could slyly touch his coat with her cheek. "I dare say Dodo likes it. She is fond of melancholy things and ugly people." "I am fond of knowing something about the people I live among," said Dorothea, who had been watching everything with the interest of a monk on his holiday tour. "It seems to me we know nothing of our neighbours, unless they are cottagers. One is constantly wondering what sort of lives other people lead, and how they take things. I am quite obliged to Mrs. Cadwallader for coming and calling me out of the library." "Quite right to feel obliged to me," said Mrs. Cadwallader. "Your rich Lowick farmers are as curious as any buffaloes or bisons, and I dare say you don't half see them at church. They are quite different from your uncle's tenants, or Sir James's. Monsters, farmers without landlords. One can't tell how to class them." "Most of these followers are not Lowick people," said Sir James. "I suppose they are legatees from a distance, or from Middlemarch. Lovegood tells me the old fellow has left a good deal of money as well as land." "Think of that now, when so many younger sons can't dine at their own expense," said Mrs. Cadwallader. "Ah!" turning round at the sound of the opening door, "here is Mr. Brooke. I felt that we were incomplete before, and here is the explanation. You are come to see this odd funeral, of course." "No, I came to look after Casaubon, to see how he goes on, you know, and to bring a little news, my dear," said Mr. Brooke, nodding at Dorothea as she came towards him. "I looked into the library, and I saw Casaubon over his books. I told him it wouldn't do. I said, 'This will never do, you know. Think of your wife, Casaubon.' And he promised me to come up. I didn't tell him my news. I said he must come up." "Ah, now they are coming out of church!" Mrs. Cadwallader exclaimed. "Dear me, what a wonderfully mixed set! Mr. Lydgater's doctor, I suppose. But that is really a good looking woman, and the fair young man must be her son. Who are they, Sir James? Do you know?" "I see Vincey, the mayor of Middlemarch. They are probably his wife and son," said Sir James, looking interrogatively at Mr. Brooke, who nodded and said, "Yes, a very decent family. A very good fellow is Vincey, a credit to the manufacturing interest. You have seen him at my house, you know." "Ah, yes, one of your secret committee," said Mrs. Cadwallader, provokingly. "A coursing fellow, though," said Sir James, with a fox hunter's disgust, "and one of those who suck the life out of the wretched handloom weavers in Tipton and Frashit. That is how his family looked so fair and sleek," said Mrs. Cadwallader. "Those dark, purple faced people are an excellent foil. Dear me, they are like a set of jugs. Do look at Humphrey. One might fancy him an ugly archangel towering above them in his white surplice." "It's a solemn thing to do, though, a funeral," said Mr. Brooke, "if you take it in that light, you know." "But I'm not taking it in that light. I can't wear my solemnity too often, else it will go to rags. It was time the old man died, and none of these people are sorry." "How piteous!" said Dorothea. "This funeral seems to me the most dismal thing I ever saw. It is a blot on the morning. I cannot bear to think that any one should die and leave no love behind." She was going to say more, but she saw her husband enter and seat himself a little in the background. The difference his presence made to her was not always a happy one. She felt that he often inwardly objected to her speech. "Positively," exclaimed Mrs. Cadwallader, "there is a new face come out from behind that broad man, queerer than any of them. A little round head with bulging eyes, a sort of frog face. Do look! He must be of another blood, I think." "Let me see," said Celia, with awakened curiosity, standing behind Mrs. Cadwallader and leaning forward over her head. "Oh, what an odd face!" Then, with a quick change to another sort of surprised expression, she added, "Why, Dodo, you never told me that Mr. Ladislaw was come again." Dorothea felt a shock of alarm. Everyone noticed her sudden paleness as she looked up immediately at her uncle, while Mr. Casaubon looked at her. "He came with me, you know. He is my guest. Puts up with me at the Grange," said Mr. Brooke, in his easiest tone, nodding at Dorothea, as if the announcement were just what she might have expected. "And we have brought the picture at the top of the carriage. I knew you would be pleased with the surprise, Casaubon. There you are to the very life, as Aquinas, you know. Quite the right sort of thing. And you will hear young Ladislaw talk about it. He talks uncommonly well, points out this, that, and the other, knows art and everything of that kind. Companionable, you know. Is up with you in any track. What I've been wanting a long while." Mr. Casaubon bowed with cold politeness, mastering his irritation, but only so far as to be silent. He remembered Will's letter quite as well as Dorothea did. He had noticed that it was not among the letters which had been reserved for him on his recovery, and secretly concluding that Dorothea had sent word to Will not to come to Lowick, he had shrunk with proud sensitiveness from ever recurring to the subject. He now inferred that she had asked her uncle to invite Will to the Grange, and she felt it impossible at that moment to enter into any explanation. Mrs. Cadwallader's eyes, diverted from the churchyard, saw a good deal of dumb show, which was not so intelligible to her as she could have desired, and could not repress the question, "Who is Mr. Ladislaw?" "A young relative of Mr. Casaubon's," said Sir James, promptly. His good nature often made him quick and clear seeing in personal matters, and he had divined from Dorothea's glance at her husband that there was some alarm in her mind. "A very nice young fellow. Casaubon has done everything for him," explained Mr. Brooke. "He repays your expense in him, Casaubon," he went on, nodding encouragingly. "I hope he will stay with me a long while, and we shall make something of my documents. I have plenty of ideas and facts, you know, and I can see he is just the man to put them into shape. Remembers what the right quotations are, omne tulit punctum, and that sort of thing. Gives subjects a kind of turn. I invited him some time ago, when you were ill, Casaubon. Dorothea said you couldn't have anybody in the house, you know, and she asked me to write." Poor Dorothea felt that every word of her uncle's was about as pleasant as a grain of sand in the eye of Mr. Casaubon. It would be altogether unfitting now to explain that she had not wished her uncle to invite Will Ladislaw. She could not in the least make clear to herself the reasons for her husband's dislike to his presence, a dislike painfully impressed on her by the scene in the library, but she felt the unbecomingness of saying anything that might convey a notion of it to others. Mr. Casaubon, indeed, had not thoroughly represented those mixed reasons to himself, irritated feeling with him, as with all of us, seeking rather for justification than for self-knowledge. But he wished to repress outward signs, and only Dorothea could discern the changes in her husband's face, before he observed, with more of dignified bending and sing-song than usual, "You are exceedingly hospitable, my dear sir, and I owe you acknowledgments for exercising your hospitality towards a relative of mine." The funeral was ended now, and the churchyard was being cleared. "Now you can see him, Mrs. Cadwallader," said Celia. "He is just like a miniature of Mr. Casaubon's aunt that hangs in Dorothea's boudoir. Quite nice looking." "A very pretty sprig," said Mrs. Cadwallader dryly. "What is your nephew to be, Mr. Casaubon?" "Pardon me, he is not my nephew. He is my cousin." "Well, you know," interposed Mr. Brooke, "he is trying his wings. He is just the sort of young fellow to rise. I should be glad to give him an opportunity. He would make a good secretary now, like Hobbes, Milton, Swift, that sort of man." "I understand," said Mrs. Cadwallader. "One who can write speeches." "I'll fetch him in now, eh, Casaubon?" said Mr. Brooke. "He wouldn't come in till I had announced him, you know. And we'll go down and look at the picture. There you are to the life. A deep, subtle sort of thinker, with his forefinger on the page, while Saint Bonaventure, or somebody else, rather fat and florid, is looking up at the Trinity. Everything is symbolical, you know, the higher style of art. I like that up to a certain point, but not too far. It's rather straining to keep up with, you know. But you are at home in that, Casaubon, and your painter's flesh is good. Solidity, transparency, everything of that sort. I went into that a great deal at one time. However, I'll go and fetch Ladislaw." Chapter 34. Middlemarch, by George Eliot. Chapter 35. Non, je ne comprends pas de plus charmant plaisir que de voir d'héritier une troupe affligée, le maintien interdit et la mine allongée, lire un long testament, ou pâle, étonné, en leur laissant bonsoir avec un pied de nez. Pour voir au naturel leur tristesse profonde, je reviendrai, je crois, exprès de l'autre monde. Regnard, le légataire universel. When the animals entered the ark in pairs, one may imagine that allied species made much private remark on each other, and were tempted to think that so many forms feeding on the same store of fodder were eminently superfluous, as tending to diminish the rations. I fear the part played by the vultures on that occasion would be too painful for art to represent, those birds being disadvantageously naked about the gullet, and apparently without rites and ceremonies. The same sort of temptation befell the Christian carnivora who formed Peter Featherstone's funeral procession, most of them having minds bent on a limited store which each would have liked to get the most of. The long recognised blood relations and connections by marriage made already a goodly number, which, multiplied by possibilities, presented a fine range for jealous conjecture and pathetic hopefulness. Jealousy of the Vinces had created a fellowship in hostility among all persons of the Featherstone blood, so that in the absence of any decided indication that one of themselves was to have more than the rest, the dread lest that long-legged Fred Vincey should have the land was necessarily dominant, though it left abundant feeling and leisure for vaguer jealousies, such as were entertained towards Mary Garth. Solomon found time to reflect that Jonah was undeserving, and Jonah to abuse Solomon as greedy. Jane, the elder sister, held that Martha's children ought not to expect so much as the young Walls, and Martha, more lax on the subject of primogeniture, was sorry to think that Jane was so having. These nearest of kin were naturally impressed with the unreasonableness of expectations in cousins and second cousins, and used their arithmetic in reckoning the large sums that small legacies might mount to, if there were too many of them. Two cousins were present to hear the will, and a second cousin besides Mr. Trumbull. This second cousin was a Middlemarch mercer of polite manners and superfluous aspirates. The two cousins were elderly men from Brassing, one of them conscious of claims on the score of inconvenient expense sustained by him in presents of oysters and other eatables to his rich cousin Peter; the other entirely saturnine, leaning his hands and chin on a stick, and conscious of claims based on no narrow performance, but on merit generally. Both blameless citizens of Brassing, who wished that Jonah Featherstone did not live there. The wit of a family is usually best received among strangers. "Why, Trumbull himself is pretty sure of 500, that you may depend. I shouldn't wonder if my brother promised him," said Solomon, musing aloud with his sisters the evening before the funeral. Dear, dear, said poor sister Martha, whose imagination of hundreds had been habitually narrowed to the amount of her unpaid rent. But in the morning all the ordinary currents of conjecture were disturbed by the presence of a strange mourner, who had plashed among them as if from the moon. This was the stranger described by Mrs. Cadwallader as Frog-Face, a man perhaps about 2 or 3 and 30, whose prominent eyes, thin-lipped, downward-curved mouth, and hair sleekly brushed away from a forehead that sank suddenly above the ridge of the eyebrows, certainly gave his face a batrachian unchangeableness of expression. Here clearly was a new legatee, else why was he bidden as a mourner? Here were new possibilities, raising a new uncertainty, which almost checked remark in the mourning coaches. We are all humiliated by the sudden discovery of a fact which has existed very comfortably and perhaps been staring at us in private while we have been making up our world entirely without it. No one had seen this questionable stranger before except Mary Garth, and she knew nothing more of him than that he had twice been to Stone Court when Mr. Featherstone was downstairs, and had sat alone with him for several hours. She had found an opportunity of mentioning this to her father, and perhaps Caleb's were the only eyes, except the lawyer's, which examined the stranger with more of inquiry than of disgust or suspicion. Caleb Garth, having little expectation and less cupidity, was interested in the verification of his own guesses, and the calmness with which he half smilingly rubbed his chin and shot intelligent glances, much as if he were valuing a tree, made a fine contrast with the alarm or scorn visible in other faces when the unknown mourner, whose name was understood to be Rigg, entered the wainscoted parlour and took his seat near the door to make part of the audience when the will should be read. Just then Mr. Solomon and Mr. Jonah were gone upstairs with the lawyer to search for the will, and Mrs. Wall, seeing 2 vacant seats between herself and Mr. Borthrop Trumbull, had the spirit to move next to that great authority, who was handling his watch seals and trimming his outlines with a determination not to show anything so compromising to a man of ability as wonder or surprise. "I suppose you know everything about what my poor brother's done, Mr. Trumbull," said Mrs. Wall, in the lowest of her woolly tones, while she turned her crape-shadowed bonnet towards Mr. Trumbull's ear. "My good lady, whatever was told me was told in confidence," said the auctioneer, putting his hand up to screen that secret. "Them who've made sure of their good luck may be disappointed yet," Mrs. Wall continued, finding some relief in this communication. "Hopes are often delusive," said Mr. Trumbull, still in confidence. "Ah!" said Mrs. Wall, looking across at the Vinces, and then moving back to the side of her sister Martha. "It's wonderful how close poor Peter was," she said, in the same undertones. "We none of us know what he might have had on his mind. I only hope and trust he wasn't a worse liver than we think of, Martha." Poor Mrs. Crench was bulky, and breathing asthmatically had the additional motive for making her remarks unexceptionable, and giving them a general bearing, that even her whispers were loud, and liable to sudden bursts like those of a deranged barrel organ. "I never was covetous, Jane," she replied, "but I have 6 children, and have buried 3, and I didn't marry into money. The eldest, that sits there, is but 19, so I leave you to guess. And stock always short, and land most awkward. But if ever I've begged and prayed, it's been to God above, though where there's one brother a bachelor, and the other childless after twice marrying, anybody might think—" Meanwhile Mr. Vincey had glanced at the passive face of Mr. Rigg, and had taken out his snuff box and tapped it, but had put it back again unopened, as an indulgence which, however clarifying to the judgment, was unsuited to the occasion. "I shouldn't wonder if Featherstone had better feelings than any of us gave him credit for," he observed, in the ear of his wife. "This funeral shows a thought about everybody. It looks well when a man wants to be followed by his friends, and if they are humble, not to be ashamed of them. I should be all the better pleased if he'd left lots of small legacies." They may be uncommonly useful to fellows in a small way. Everything is as handsome as could be, crape and silk and everything, said Mrs. Vincey contentedly. But I am sorry to say that Fred was under some difficulty in repressing a laugh, which would have been more unsuitable than his father's snuff box. Fred had overheard Mr. Jonah suggesting something about a love child, and with this thought in his mind, the stranger's face, which happened to be opposite him, affected him too ludicrously. Mary Garth, discerning his distress in the twitchings of his mouth and his recourse to a cough, came cleverly to his rescue by asking him to change seats with her, so that he got into a shadowy corner. Fred was feeling as good naturedly as possible towards everybody, including Rigg, and having some relenting towards all these people who were less lucky than he was aware of being himself, he would not for the world have behaved amiss. Still, it was particularly easy to laugh. But the entrance of the lawyer and the two brothers drew everyone's attention. The lawyer was Mr. Standish, and he had come to Stone Court this morning, believing that he knew thoroughly well who would be pleased and who disappointed before the day was over. The will he expected to read was the last of three which he had drawn up for Mr. Featherstone. Mr. Standish was not a man who varied his manners. He behaved with the same deep-voiced, off-hand civility to everybody, as if he saw no difference in them, and talked chiefly of the hay-crop, which would be "very fine, by God," of the last bulletins concerning the king, and of the Duke of Clarence, who was a sailor, every inch of him, and just the man to rule over an island like Britain. Old Featherstone had often reflected, as he sat looking at the fire, that Standish would be surprised some day. It is true that if he had done as he liked at the last, and burnt the will drawn up by another lawyer, he would not have secured that minor end. Still, he had had his pleasure in ruminating on it. And certainly Mr. Standish was surprised, but not at all sorry. On the contrary, he rather enjoyed the zest of a little curiosity in his own mind, which the discovery of a second will added to the prospective amazement on the part of the Featherstone family. As to the sentiments of Solomon and Jonah, they were held in utter suspense. It seemed to them that the old will would have had a certain validity, and that there might be such an interlacement of poor Peter's former and latter intentions as to create endless lawing before anybody came by their own, an inconvenience which would have at least the advantage of going all round. Hence the brothers showed a thoroughly neutral gravity as they re-entered with Mr. Standish. But Solomon took out his white handkerchief again, with a sense that in any case there would be affecting passages, and crying at funerals, however dry, was customarily served up in lawn. Perhaps the person who felt the most throbbing excitement at this moment was Mary Garth, in the consciousness that it was she who had virtually determined the production of this second will, which might have momentous effects on the lot of some persons present. No soul except herself knew what had passed on that final night. "The will I hold in my hand," said Mr. Standish, who, seated at the table in the middle of the room, took his time about everything, including the coughs with which he showed a disposition to clear his voice, "was drawn up by myself and executed by our deceased friend on the 9th of August, 1825. But I find that there is a subsequent instrument hitherto unknown to me, bearing date the 20th of July, 1826, hardly a year later than the previous one. And there is farther, I see." Mr. Standish was cautiously travelling over the document with his spectacles, "a codicil to this latter will, bearing date March the 1st, 1828. "Dear, dear," said Sister Martha, not meaning to be audible, but driven to some articulation under this pressure of dates. "I shall begin by reading the earlier will," continued Mr. Standish, "since such, as appears by his not having destroyed the document, was the intention of deceased." The preamble was felt to be rather long, and several besides Solomon shook their heads pathetically, looking on the ground. all eyes avoided meeting other eyes, and were chiefly fixed either on the spots in the tablecloth or on Mr. Standish's bald head, excepting Mary Garth's. When all the rest were trying to look nowhere in particular, it was safe for her to look at them, and at the sound of the first "give" and "bequeath," she could see all complexions changing subtly, as if some faint vibration were passing through them, save that of Mr. Rigg. He sat in unaltered calm, and in fact the company, preoccupied with more important problems, and with the complication of listening to bequests which might or might not be revoked, had ceased to think of him. Fred blushed, and Mr. Vincey found it impossible to do without his snuff box in his hand, though he kept it closed. The small bequests came first, and even the recollection that there was another will, and that poor Peter might have thought better of it, could not quell the rising disgust and indignation. One likes to be done well by in every tense, past, present, and future, and here was Peter capable 5 years ago of leaving only 200 apiece to his own brothers and sisters, and only 100 apiece to his own nephews and nieces. The Garths were not mentioned, but Mrs. Vincey and Rosamond were each to have 100. Mr. Trumbull was to have the gold-headed cane and £50. The other second cousins and the cousins present were each to have the like handsome sum, which, as the saturnine cousin observed, was a sort of legacy that left a man nowhere, and there was much more of such offensive dribbling in favour of persons not present, problematical, and, it was to be feared, low connections. Altogether, reckoning hastily, here were about 3000 disposed of. Where then had Peter meant the rest of the money to go, and where the land? And what was revoked, and what not revoked? And was the revocation for better or for worse? All emotion must be conditional, and might turn out to be the wrong thing. The men were strong enough to bear up and keep quiet under this confused suspense, some letting their lower lip fall, others pursing it up, according to the habit of their muscles. But Jane and Martha sank under the rush of questions, and began to cry, poor Mrs. Cranch being half moved with the consolation of getting any hundreds at all, without working for them, and half aware that her share was scanty; whereas Mrs. Wall's mind was entirely flooded with the sense of being an own sister, and getting little, while somebody else was to have much. The general expectation now was that the much would fall to Fred Vincey, but the Vinceys themselves were surprised when £10,000 in specified investments were declared to be bequeathed to him. Was the land coming too? Fred bit his lips. It was difficult to help smiling, and Mrs. Vincey felt herself the happiest of women. Possible revocation shrinking out of sight in this dazzling vision. There was still a residue of personal property as well as the land, but the whole was left to one person, and that person was, oh possibilities, oh expectations founded on the favour of close old gentlemen, oh endless vocatives that would still leave expression slipping helpless from the measurement of mortal folly. That residuary legatee was Joshua Rigg, who was also sole executor, and who was to take thenceforth the name of Featherstone. There was a rustling which seemed like a shudder running round the room. Every one stared afresh at Mr. Rigg, who apparently experienced no surprise. "A most singular testamentary disposition!" exclaimed Mr. Trumbull, preferring for once that he should be considered ignorant in the past. "But there is a second will, there is a further document. We have not yet heard the final wishes of the deceased." Mary Garth was feeling that what they had yet to hear were not the final wishes. The second will revoked everything except the legacies to the low persons before mentioned, some alterations in these being the occasion of the codicil, and the bequest of all the land lying in Lowick parish, with all the stock and household furniture, to Joshua Rigg. The residue of the property was to be devoted to the erection and endowment of almshouses for old men, to be called Featherstone's Almshouses, and to be built on a piece of land near Middlemarch, already bought for the purpose by the testator, he wishing, so the document declared, to please God Almighty. Nobody present had a farthing, but Mr. Trumbull had the gold-headed cane. It took some time for the company to recover the power of expression. Mary dared not look at Fred. Mr. Vincey was the first to speak, after using his snuff-box energetically, and he spoke with loud indignation. "The most unaccountable will I ever heard! I should say he was not in his right mind when he made it. I should say this last will was void," added Mr. Vincey, feeling that this expression put the thing in the true light. "Eh, Standish?" "Our deceased friend always knew what he was about, I think," said Mr. Standish. "Everything is quite regular. Here is a letter from Clements of Brassing tied with the will. He drew it up. A very respectable solicitor." "I never noticed any alienation of mind, any aberration of intellect in the late Mr. Featherstone," said Borthrop Trumbull, "but I call this will eccentric. I was always willingly of service to the old soul, and he intimated pretty plainly a sense of obligation which would show itself in his will. The gold-headed cane is farcical considered as an acknowledgment to me, but happily I am above mercenary considerations." "There's nothing very surprising in the matter that I can see," said Caleb Garth. "Anybody might have had more reason for wondering if the will had been what you might expect from an open-minded, straightforward man. For my part, I wish there was no such thing as a will." "That's a strange sentiment to come from a Christian man, by God!" said the lawyer. "I should like to know how you will back that up, Garth." "Oh," said Caleb, leaning forward, adjusting his finger-tips with nicety, and looking meditatively on the ground. It always seemed to him that words were the hardest part of business. But here Mr. Jonah Featherstone made himself heard. "Well, he always was a fine hypocrite, was my brother Peter. But this will cuts out everything. If I had known a waggon and 6 horses shouldn't have drawn me from Brassing, I'll put a white hat and drab coat on to-morrow." "Dear, dear!" wept Mrs. Cranch. "And we've been at the expense of travelling, and that poor lad sitting idle here so long! It's the first time I ever heard my brother Peter was so wishful to please God Almighty. But if I was to be struck helpless, I must say it's hard. I can think no other." "It'll do him no good where he's gone, that's my belief," said Solomon, with a bitterness which was remarkably genuine, though his tone could not help being sly. "Peter was a bad liver, and almshouses won't cover it when he's had the impudence to show it at the last, and all the while had got his own lawful family, brothers and sisters, and nephews and nieces, and has sat in church with 'em whenever he thought well to come," said Mrs. Wall, "and might have left his property so respectable to them that's never been used to extravagance or unsteadiness in no manner of way, and not so poor but what they could have saved every penny, and made more of it. And me, the trouble I've been at, times and times, to come here and be sisterly, and him with things on his mind all the while that might make anybody's flesh creep. But if the Almighty's allowed it, he means to punish him for it. Brother Solomon, I shall be going, if you'll drive me." "I've no desire to put my foot on the premises again," said Solomon. "I've got land of my own and property of my own to will away." "It's a poor tale how luck goes in the world," said Jonah. "It never answers to have a bit of spirit in you. You'd better be a dog in the manger. But those above ground might learn a lesson. One fool's will is enough in a family." "There's more ways than one of being a fool," said Solomon. "I shan't leave my money to be poured down the sink, and I shan't leave it to fondlings from Africay. I like Featherstones that were brewed such, and not turned Featherstones with sticking the name on 'em." Solomon addressed these remarks in a loud aside to Mrs. Wall, and he rose to accompany her. Brother Jonah felt himself capable of much more stinging wit than this, but he reflected that there was no use in offending the new proprietor of Stone Court until you were certain that he was quite without intentions of hospitality towards witty men whose name he was about to bear. Mr. Joshua Rigg, in fact, appeared to trouble himself little about any innuendoes, but showed a notable change of manner, walking coolly up to Mr. Standish, and putting business questions with much coolness. He had a high, chirping voice and a vile accent. Fred, whom he no longer moved to laughter, thought him the lowest monster he had ever seen. But Fred was feeling rather sick. The Middlemarch mercer waited for an opportunity of engaging Mr. Rigg in conversation. There was no knowing how many pairs of legs the new proprietor might require hose for, and profits were more to be relied on than legacies. Also the mercer, as a second cousin, was dispassionate enough to feel curiosity. Mr. Vincey, after his one outburst, had remained proudly silent, though too much preoccupied with unpleasant feelings to think of moving, till he observed that his wife had gone to Fred's side, and was crying silently while she held her darling's hand. He rose immediately, and turning his back on the company, while he said to her in an undertone, "Don't give way, Lucy. Don't make a fool of yourself, my dear, before these people," he added, in his usual loud voice, "Go and order the phaeton, Fred. I have no time to waste." Mary Garth had before this been getting ready to go home with her father. She met Fred in the hall, and now for the first time had the courage to look at him. He had that withered sort of paleness which will sometimes come on young faces, and his hand was very cold when she shook it. Mary, too, was agitated. She was conscious that fatally, without will of her own, she had perhaps made a great difference to Fred's lot. "Good bye," she said, with affectionate sadness. "Be brave, Fred. I do believe you are better without the money. What was the good of it to Mr. Featherstone?" "That's all very fine," said Fred, pettishly. "What is a fellow to do? I must go into the church now." He knew that this would vex Mary. Very well, then she must tell him what else he could do. "And I thought I should be able to pay your father at once and make everything right. And you have not even £100 left you. What shall you do now, Mary?" "Take another situation, of course, as soon as I can get one. My father has enough to do to keep the rest without me. Good bye." In a very short time Stone Court was cleared of well-brewed Featherstones and other long accustomed visitors. Another stranger had been brought to settle in the neighbourhood of Middlemarch, but in the case of Mr. Rigg Featherstone there was more discontent with immediate visible consequences than speculation as to the effect which his presence might have in the future. No soul was prophetic enough to have any foreboding as to what might appear on the trail of Joshua Rigg. And here I am naturally led to reflect on the means of elevating a low subject. Historical parallels are remarkably efficient in this way. The chief objection to them is, that the diligent narrator may lack space, or, what is often the same thing, may not be able to think of them with any degree of particularity, though he may have a philosophical confidence that if known they would be illustrative. It seems an easier and shorter way to dignity to observe that, since there never was a true story which could not be told in parables, where you might put a monkey for a Margrave, and vice versa, whatever has been or is to be narrated by me about low people may be ennobled by being considered a parable; so that if any bad habits and ugly consequences are brought into view, the reader may have the relief of regarding them as not more than figuratively ungenteel, and may feel himself virtually in company with persons of some style. Thus, while I tell the truth about Lubies, my reader's imagination need not be entirely excluded from an occupation with lords; and the petty sums which any bankrupt of high standing would be sorry to retire upon, may be lifted to the level of high commercial transactions by the inexpensive addition of proportional ciphers. As to any provincial history in which the agents are all of high moral rank, that must be of a date long posterior to the first Reform Bill, and Peter Featherstone, you perceive, was dead and buried some months before Lord Grey came into office. Chapter 35